Beneath the gentle morning sun, Willow Creek Valley in Wyoming unfolds like a serene painting. The endless fields of barley sway in the breeze, as if whispering the stories of this land. At the heart of this picturesque scene is the small farm of Emily Carter, a woman known to the whole town simply as a quiet single mother who has spent recent years cultivating the land and caring for her 2 young children. Yet, none of the curious neighbors or local shopkeepers realize that behind Emily's deep blue eyes and gentle smile lies a secret that could leave anyone speechless. She was once an elite marksman in the Green Berets, with 2,117 confirmed kills throughout her military career. Emily stood on the porch of the old wooden house, holding a cup of cold coffee, her eyes scanning the horizon where the sun had just risen. She wore a worn flannel shirt and faded jeans, her boots covered in dirt from days spent working in the fields. Today was supposed to be an ordinary day, or at least she wanted it to be. The cheerful chirping of birds blended with the gentle breeze rustling through the dense pines surrounding the farm, creating a serene melody she had learned to cherish. This was a life she had chosen, a life far from gunfire, the roaring commands over the radio, and sleepless nights in distant war zones. But sometimes, as she gazed out the fields, memories washed over her like a wave, pulling her back to days when her hands held not a hoe but a sniper rifle, her eyes searching not for seeds but for enemies lurking in the shadows. Emily's 2 children, Grace, 14, and Liam, 8, are the reason she left everything behind. Grace has long brown hair like her mother, with bright eyes that sparkle with endless curiosity, while Liam has inherited a mischievous streak and a wide grin that makes everyone laugh. This morning, Grace is herding the chickens into the coop, grumbling about having to wake up early, while Liam is bouncing around the yard with their sheepdog, Max, trying to throw a worn-out tennis ball. Watching them, Emily feels her heart warm, but also feels heavy. She has sacrificed her past to give them a future, a life free from gunfire and fear. But deep down, she knows that the past never truly sleeps. It just waits, like a predator quietly lurking in the shadows. The Carter farm isn't large, but it holds a special significance. It once belonged to Emily's grandparents, where she grew up surrounded by sunny summers and freezing winter days. After leaving the military, she bought this piece of land from her retired uncle, determined to turn it into a home for Grace and Liam after her brief marriage fell apart. The early days were tough. The bank hounded her over unpaid loans, the land was barren after years of neglect, and she was more accustomed to fighting than farming. But Emily wasn't one to give up easily. She learned to fix fences with the precision of someone who once assembled weapons, planted seeds with the patience of a sharpshooter waiting for the perfect shot. And gradually, the farm began to come back to life. The people of Willow Creek saw her as a hard-working woman, but no one knew that every nail she hammered, every inch of land she tilled, bore the marks of 20 years of grueling military training. That morning, as Emily stood gazing at the fields, she heard Grace calling from afar. "Mom, Mr. Hank just called. He said there were some strange guys at the diner last night asking about our farm." Grace's voice rang out, filled with both worry and curiosity. Emily set her coffee cup down, stepped off the porch, her eyes narrowing slightly as they would when she used to survey a battlefield. "What did they ask?" she replied, her tone calm, but her mind was already analyzing the situation. Grace ran up, breathless. "They asked who owns the farm, how many people live here, and even about the bank loans. Mr. Hank said they look like regular folks dressed in leather with strange tattoos." Emily nodded, keeping her emotions in check, but inside, a familiar feeling stirred, one that belonged to someone who had survived countless ambushes. She turned back to look at the field, but this time it wasn't just to admire the scenery. Her eyes scanned the horizon, searching for any signs of trouble, a shadowy figure, a strange vehicle, or anything that didn't belong in this peaceful picture. Nothing stood out, but her instincts told her that the calm breeze was about to shift. She had faced dangers far worse than motorcycle gangs, terrorists, mercenaries, those who never showed their faces. But now, she was no longer a lone warrior on the battlefield. She was a mother, and anyone who dared to threaten Grace or Liam would have to reckon with a version of Emily she had buried long ago. "Just focus on your work, Grace," Emily said, her voice gentle yet firm. "I'll head over to Mr. Hank's place and check things out." Grace nodded, though her eyes were still filled with questions. As Grace turned away, Emily stepped inside the house, opened the kitchen cabinet, and pulled out a fruit knife not to use it, but to check her hands. She twirled the blade between her fingers with the finesse of someone who had disassembled guns in the dark, then set it down. It had been a long time since she had touched a weapon, but the memories of those days were vivid in every muscle, every breath. She didn't want to go back down that path, but if Willow Creek was about to become a battlefield, Emily Carter wouldn't let her family become prey. Emily Carter stepped out of the wooden house, the early sunlight shining on her neatly tied brown hair, highlighting a few silver strands she didn't bother to hide. She pulled down her old baseball cap, shielding her eyes as they scanned the farm with focus that only those who have survived war can understand. Grace had returned to the chickens, while Liam was struggling with a tennis ball alongside Max, the loyal sheepdog Emily had adopted from a nearby farm 2 years ago. Liam's bright laughter rang out in the peaceful air of Willow Creek, and in that moment, Emily felt her heart lighten. This was the reason she had given up everything to medals, the pats on the back from teammates, and the long, sleepless nights with a sniper rifle in hand. But Grace's warning about the strange men at Hank's diner was impossible to ignore. This sense of peace, she knew, could just be a fragile veneer before a storm was about to hit. She stepped into the small shed next to the farm, where the scent of dry grass and machine oil mingled with the cool morning air. The farming tools were neatly arranged on shelves: a hoe, a shovel, and even an old plow that she had repaired herself a few months ago. But it wasn't these things she was looking for. In the corner of the shed, behind a dusty wooden plank, was where she had hidden a part of her past. Emily pushed the plank aside, revealing a gray metal box, securely locked with a combination lock. She didn't need to open it just yet, but merely touching its cold surface made her feel the weight of the years gone by. Inside was the M24 sniper rifle she had once used in the military, along with a tactical outfit, and a few boxes of ammunition, all carefully preserved just like the day she put them away. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a part of who she was, a part she had tried to bury when she left the Green Berets. 20 years in the military is not an easy story to tell, even for Emily herself. She joined the Army right after graduating high school, a small-town girl from Wyoming with dreams of escaping the wheat fields to seek something greater. But she never imagined that something greater would be the dusty battlefields of the Middle East, the dense jungles of South America, and the dark streets of Eastern Europe. As one of the few women in the Green Berets, she had to prove herself twice as much as the others. And she did, not just through strength or bravery, but with deadly precision through the sniper scope. 2,117 confirmed kills is not a number to boast about. It's a burden she carries in every dream. Every time she jolts awake in the middle of the night from the sound of the wind banging against the window, mistaking for the footsteps of an enemy. When Grace was born, Emily knew she couldn't go on. She had seen too many comrades fall, too many families shattered by war, and she didn't want her daughter to grow up with a mother who only knew about guns and battles. Then Liam came along, and the decision to leave the military became inevitable. She returned to Willow Creek, bought back the old farm, and started over. But the skills she had learned never really left her. The way she fixed the fences, how she observed the fields, the way she taught Grace and Liam to pay attention to the little details, all of it bore the mark of a warrior. Grace once asked, "Mom, where'd you learn to tie a rope so tightly?" Emily just smiled and replied, "I learned from life, sweetie." But the truth was, she learned it in those grueling training sessions, where tying not even a fraction wrong could cost a whole team their lives. Now, standing in the warehouse with her hand resting on the metal box, Emily felt a chill run down her spine. The strangers Grace mentioned were not just a bunch of ordinary, curious people. She knew that, not through logic, but through an instinct that had helped her survive countless dangerous missions. She closed the board, stepped outside, and carefully locked the storage door. Max ran up to her, wagging his tail happily, but the dog's eyes sparkled with caution that she recognized immediately. "You feel it too, don't you?" she whispered, stroking Max's head. The dog let out a soft bark, as if in agreement, and Emily smiled a smile that wasn't entirely cheerful, but held a sense of determination, ready for whatever was coming. She turned back to the house, calling Grace and Liam inside. Today, you two are staying home with me, okay? She said, her voice gentle but without a hint of hesitation. Liam jumped up excitedly. Awesome. I don't want to go to school. Grace looked at her mother, her gaze sharp as if she sensed something was off. Mom, is something wrong? She asked. Emily sat down, pulling both kids close. It's just that I want you two to be near me today. There might be some strangers around, and I want to make sure everything is okay. Liam nodded, not questioning it, but Grace remained silent, as if she were trying to piece together the puzzle in her mind. Emily stood up, walked over to the window, and looked outside. The fields of wheat were still swaying in the breeze, but this time she didn't see the peaceful beauty anymore. She noticed the hidden corners, the blind spots an army could exploit to get closer. In the military, she had been a predator, always staying one step ahead of the enemy. But now, she was a protector, and whoever her opponent was would soon realize they had picked the wrong person to confront. She didn't want to fight anymore, didn't want blood spilled on the land she had sweat to revive. But if those strangers dared to cross the line, dared to touch Grace or Liam, then Emily Carter wouldn't hesitate to remind them that a Green Beret sharpshooter never truly retires, she just puts her weapon down for a moment. She turned back to look at her two kids, sitting on the sofa with Max sprawled out beside them. I'm heading into town for a bit to see Mr. Hank, she said, putting on her old coat and pulling on her hat. You two lock the door tight, okay? Grace nodded, her expression serious, while Liam grinned widely. Bring back donuts, okay? Emily laughed and nodded, but as she stepped out the door, her smile vanished, replaced by a sharp focus. The breeze carried the scent of earth and dry grass. But in Emily's mind, it felt like the smell of gunpowder from a past she couldn't escape forever. Emily Carter's old pickup rumbled down the dirt road, leading into the heart of Willow Creek, dust swirling behind her like a warning no one noticed. It was still early in the morning, but the sun was already blazing, shining through the dusty windshield and highlighting the tiny wrinkles on her face, remnants of long days in the sun, and even longer nights in the dark. She drove with quiet focus, gripping the steering wheel tightly, but her mind was racing. The strangers Grace had mentioned were no small matter, not in a town like Willow Creek, where everyone knew each car and every face. Emily didn't like this feeling, the one she had come to know all too well from her days in the Green Berets, when the enemy was lurking, but you hadn't yet caught a glimpse of them. Hank's Diner sat right at the main intersection of town, a low wooden building with a faded sign hanging from a post that read, Hank's Diner. This was the heart of Willow Creek, where farmers gathered to sip coffee, where housewives chatted away, and where kids dashed in and out begging for candy. Emily parked next to someone's rusty red pickup, turned off the engine and stepped out. The little bell chimed as she pushed the door open, and the smell of toasted bread and sizzling bacon hit her instantly, mingling with the lively chatter of a few early customers. Hank, a thin old man with wispy white hair and sharp eyes, was wiping down the counter with an old rag. He looked up, saw Emily, and broke into a warm smile, but that smile quickly faded when he noticed a serious look on her face. Hey, Hank, Emily said, pulling her baseball cap down a little lower, her voice soft but laced with curiosity. She sat down on a stool near the counter, resting her hands on the worn wooden surface. Grace told me you called this morning. What's going on? Hank stopped wiping the counter, glancing around to make sure no one was eavesdropping, then leaned closer to her. Last night, a few strange guys came by here, he whispered, his voice raspy from age but still sharp. They're not locals, and they're not your typical visitors. They were dressed in black leather, wearing low-brim caps, and had some weird tattoos on their arms that looked like symbols from some gang. They were asking about your farm, Emily, who owns it, whether you live alone or with someone, and even about your bank loans. Emily nodded slowly, keeping her emotions in check, but in her mind, everything began to piece together like a tactical map. She took a sip of the coffee that Hank had just poured, letting the bitter taste slide down her throat, helping her stay calm. Did they say anything else? She asked. Hank shrugged, his eyes squinting as if trying to remember. Not much, but the way they asked wasn't your typical curiosity. They seemed calculating, like they were planning something. One guy even smirked when I told him your farm was having trouble with the bank, like a bunch of guys who know they're about to win a bet. Emily set her coffee cup down, her hand instinctively clenching into a fist under the counter. She recognized this type of person predators, those who think they can devour anyone weaker than themselves. But they didn't realize that the prey they were targeting was far from weak. "Thank you, Hank," she said, standing up and lightly tapping the counter. "If they come back, just call me right away." Hank nodded, a hint of worry in his eyes. "Be careful, Emily. I don't like this crowd at all. They're not like the usual drunks or petty thieves." Emily smiled softly, a smile that wasn't exactly cheerful but had a touch of coldness to it. "I know how to handle it. Don't worry." She stepped out of the bar, the bell jingling once more, but this time it sounded like an alarm ringing in her head. As she stepped outside, the bright sunlight made her squint. She stood still for a moment, taking the main street of Willow Creek. A few trucks loaded with hay rolling by slowly, an elderly woman walking her dog, and some kids riding their bikes and laughing. Everything looked peaceful, but Emily wasn't fooled. She had seen the most serene places turn into battlefields in just a few minutes. She turned back to her car, but before she got in, she heard the roar of an engine in the distance. A sleek black motorcycle sped across the road, the rider clad in leather, a helmet obscuring their face. They didn't stop, but as they zoomed past, Emily caught a glimpse of a tattoo on their arm, an eagle clutching a gun, just like the one Hank had described. Her heart raced, not out of fear, but from adrenaline, the familiar rush from her days as a sharpshooter. Emily got in the car, started the engine, and drove toward the farm. On the way, she couldn't stop thinking about those guys. Who were they? A local motorcycle gang? Or a bunch of mercenaries hired to stir up trouble? Whatever they were, they had picked the wrong person to mess with. She wasn't some weak, single mom struggling with debt, like they thought. She was a former Green Beret, someone who had survived missions that would make even the toughest of the tough tremble. When she arrived at the farm, Grace and Liam ran out to greet her, Max barking joyfully. "Did you get donuts, Mom?" Liam asked, his eyes shining bright. Emily laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. "Not yet, but I will later. Now, let's head inside. I need to check on a few things." She stepped out into the backyard, gazing at the shimmering fields of golden wheat. Those strangers might be watching right now, thinking they'd found an easy target. But Emily knew better than anyone. In the game of predator and prey, the survivor isn't the biggest one, but the one who knows how to hide until a moment is right. And she was ready to prove that they had misjudged their opponent, a mistake they would come to regret. Emily Carter stood in the backyard of the farm, her dusty boots pressing against the hard, dry ground of Willow Creek. A gentle breeze swept through, making the wheat sway like waves, but she no longer felt the peace in that scene. The roar of a motorcycle engine from town still echoed in her mind, like a warning she couldn't ignore. She turned to look at Grace and Liam, her two kids playing with Max near the porch. Liam's smile lit up as he tossed the ball to the dog, while Grace sat on the steps, holding a small stick, doodling meaningless circles in the dirt. Watching them, Emily felt her heart tighten, not out of fear, but with a steely resolve. No one was going to harm her family, not now, not ever. She walked up to the wooden fence surrounding the farm, her hands checking each post with the carefulness of someone inspecting weapons before a battle. Everything looked normal, no strange footprints, no signs of intrusion, but Emily wasn't fooled by this calm. The guys Hank mentioned weren't the type to act on a whim. They had a plan, and the way they inquired about the bank debt showed they weren't just looking to rob her. They wanted to corner her, to turn this farm into their prize. But they didn't know that Emily Carter wasn't someone who could be easily subdued. She had faced far more dangerous foes, terrorists hiding in caves, arms dealers lurking in the shadows, and she had always been the last one standing. "Grace, Liam," she called, her voice calm but with a sharp edge. The two kids looked up. Max stopped barking and ran over to her. "Come inside. I need you both to help with something." Grace stood up, brushing dust off her jeans, her keen eyes seeming to sense something. "Help with what, Mom?" she asked. Emily smiled softly, hiding the tension inside. "Check the windows and doors. See if they're locked tight. I want to make sure everything is safe." Liam jumped up, excited as if this were a game. "Like in a spy movie, right, Mom?" he asked, his eyes shining bright. Emily laughed, ruffling his hair. Yeah, just like that. Now let's go, little hero. As the kids ran into the house, Emily turned back to look at the field, this time with the eyes of a warrior. She scanned every shadowy corner of the thicket near the small stream, the path leading into the pine forest, and the low hill to the east. If she were the attacker, those would be the spots she'd choose to hide and observe. But she wasn't the attacker. She was a protector, and that changed everything. In the military, she learned that defense isn't just about waiting. It's about anticipating, preparing, and turning the environment around her into an advantage. This farm wasn't just a home. It was a potential battleground, and Emily was ready to turn it into a fortress if needed. She stepped into the shed once more, the dim light from the small window illuminating the metal box hidden behind a wooden plank. This time, she didn't just touch it. She knelt down, entering the code on the lock a sequence of numbers she would never forget. The birthdays of Grace and Liam. The box clicked open with a soft sound, revealing the M24 sniper rifle snugly nestled in foam padding. She didn't pick it up, but just looking at it was enough to flood her with memories. Long nights lying in wait on the sand dunes, her breath steady in rhythm with her heartbeat, her finger lightly resting on the trigger, and then the sharp, clean crack that ended a threat from hundreds of meters away. She had once been a ghost, a nightmare for her enemies, but now all she wanted was to be a normal mother. But those strangers might not give her any other choice. Emily packed up, stood up, and stepped outside. She heard Grace calling from inside the house. "Mom, everything's locked tight. Is something wrong?" Emily walked in and saw her two kids in the living room, with Max sprawled out beside them. "It's nothing major," she said softly. "I just wanted to be a little careful. Now you two get started on your homework while I go check things outside." Grace nodded, but her eyes were still filled with doubt. Liam, on the other hand, grinned widely. "Mom, you really look like a superhero." Emily smiled, but that smile didn't last long. She stepped out onto the porch, closed the door behind her, and stood still, listening to the wind. From a distance, she heard the sound of engines, not just one, but several motorcycles roaring like a pack of wild beasts. She squinted, looking toward the road leading into Willow Creek. 3 sleek black motorcycles appeared, kicking up a cloud of dust behind them. The riders, clad in leather jackets and helmets that obscured their faces, moved with a slow, deliberate grace that told Emily they were anything but ordinary. One of them turned his head, his gaze hidden behind dark glasses, seemingly scanning her farm. He didn't stop, but the way he tilted his head sent a chill down her spine. It was the look of a predator sizing up its prey, and in his eyes, Emily was nothing more than a vulnerable single mother, an easy target. She stood still, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets. But in her mind, everything was in motion. These guys could be a local motorcycle gang, or maybe mercenaries thinking they had the upper hand. They saw a small farm, a single woman, and bank debts they could exploit. But they didn't know that Emily Carter was more than just a farmer. She was a former Green Beret, someone who had turned the cockiest of foes into corpses before they even realized what hit them. She didn't want to fight, didn't want blood spilled on this land, but if they dared to cross the line, she would show them the biggest mistake of their lives, underestimating their opponent. Emily turned back to look at Grace and Liam through the window. Her 2 kids were all she had, and she would do anything to protect them. The sound of the motorcycle faded into the distance, but she knew they would be back. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool air of Willow Creek fill her lungs. A storm was coming, and even though she didn't want to, she was ready to face it not as a victim, but as a warrior. The sound of the motorcycle engines gradually faded into the air, leaving Willow Creek in its familiar silence. But Emily Carter no longer felt at peace. She stood on the porch, her hands shoved deep into her jacket pockets, her eyes following the fine dust still lingering on the road leading into town. The midday sun shone down, highlighting the golden wheat fields. But in her mind, that scene was no different from a potential battlefield. The guys on the motorcycles were not just a random bunch of thugs. The way they moved, the way they watched, all radiated a professionalism she had seen in the most dangerous members of the military. But they didn't know that Emily wasn't an easy target like they thought. She had once been a hunter, and if necessary, she would return to that role. She stepped into the house, clicked the door shut behind her, and looked at Grace and Liam sitting at the kitchen table. Grace was deeply focused on her math homework, her brow furrowed, while Liam was busy sketching a dog that looked like Max on a piece of paper. Max lay stretched out on the floor, his ears twitching as if he was listening to something too. "Is everything okay, Mom?" Grace asked, looking up from her book, her voice tinged with a hint of worry she tried to hide. Emily nodded, sitting down across from her two kids. "Everything's fine, sweetie. I just want you both to be a little careful over the next few days. If you see anyone strange around here, let me know right away, okay?" Liam nodded eagerly. "Like a secret agent, right, Mom? I'll do great." Grace stayed quiet for a moment, then gave a slight nod, her sharp gaze seeming to try to read her mother's thoughts. Emily stood up, walked to the window, and looked outside once more. She didn't want the kids to worry, but she also couldn't hide things from them forever. Grace was 14, old enough to sense when something was off, and Liam, though still young, had a keen intuition that always amazed her. She had taught them to pay attention to details from a young age, how to spot footprints in the dirt, how to listen for strange sounds or wind, how to stay calm when things got tense. Not because she wanted to turn them into warriors, but because she wanted them to survive no matter what happened. But now, with those strangers showing up, she wondered if she was dragging them into a world she had tried so hard to escape. She turned back, grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge, and sat down next to Liam. "That's beautiful, sweetie," she said, pointing at the boy's drawing. Liam beamed. "I drew Max as a superhero, see? He's going to protect us." Emily smiled, but inside that smile felt heavy. Max could guard them against foxes or stray dogs, but those guys on motorcycles were a whole different threat. She knew they would come back not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they would definitely show up. And when they did, they would think they were facing a weak single mother struggle with a farm and debts. They would smirk, like the guy Hank mentioned, confident that they had everything under control. But they didn't know that Emily Carter had once been a ghost on the battlefield, a sharpshooter who could take down a target from half a mile away without leaving a trace. She stood up, stepped out the front yard, and looked up at the deep blue sky of Wyoming. A few white clouds drifted lazily by, but she could feel a storm brewing not in the sky, but right here on this land. Those guys, whoever they were, had picked the wrong person to mess with. They saw a small farm, a single mother, and an opportunity to take advantage. But Emily saw a battleground, a family to protect, and a past ready to rise up if pushed. She didn't want to fight. She had put down her weapons in search of peace, but if they dared to come, she wouldn't hesitate to remind them that a former Green Beret never truly retires. She had just temporarily set her weapon aside, and if it came down to it, she would pick it up again. Emily took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill her lungs. She could hear Grace and Liam laughing and joking inside the house, and Max barking softly as they teased him. Those were the sounds she would trade anything to hold on to. The guys on motorcycles might think they were stronger, that they had the upper hand. But they didn't realize that true strength doesn't come from numbers or weapons. It comes from the will of a mother who is ready to do anything to protect her child. She turned back to look at the farm, her deep blue eyes shining with determination. A storm was coming, and Emily Carter was ready not to run away, but to stand her ground. The afternoon in Willow Creek drifted by at a slow pace, with soft golden sunlight filtering through the wheat stalks, casting a gentle glow over Emily Carter's farm, like a picturesque countryside painting. But the atmosphere inside the old wooden house felt heavy, as if a storm was quietly brewing on the horizon. From inside, Liam's bright laughter echoed as he tossed a worn tennis ball to Max, the loyal sheepdog, while Grace grumbled about her math homework in the typical tone of a frustrated teenager. Emily stood on the front porch, her dusty boots pressing down on the hard ground, her deep blue eyes scanning the horizon where the sleek black motorcycles had appeared that morning. They hadn't returned yet, but she knew with the sharp intuition honed over 20 years in the Green Berets that this silence was just a fragile veneer hiding a growing threat. The strangers Hank had mentioned, with eagle tattoos clutching guns and cold, steely gazes, were not the kind of people who came and went without leaving a mark. They were lurking, plotting, and Emily understood that she couldn't sit idly by any longer. She stepped into the house, gently closing the door so as not to startle the kids, the hinges creaking with a familiar dry sound. Grace was sitting at the kitchen table, a math book sprawled open in front of her, her eyebrows furrowed tightly as if she were wrestling with a tricky problem she didn't want to solve. Liam was sprawled out on the worn wooden floor, playing with Max using an old piece of rope, giggling every time the dog jumped up, clumsily trying to grab it with his paws. "I'm just going to grab some stuff in the shed for a bit," Emily said, her tone calm as if she were merely going to fetch a bucket or a hoe for the farm work. Grace looked up and nodded, but her sharp gaze held a hint of suspicion, as if she sensed her mother was hiding something important. Liam beamed, his eyes bright. "Mom, bring back something fun to play with, like a sword or a toy gun. I want to be a knight." Emily smiled, ruffling the boy's hair, feeling the soft strands of Liam's hair beneath her fingers. But inside, that smile was just a mask hiding the emotional storm brewing within her. She didn't want the kids to know that the toys she was about to retrieve weren't for play. They were a part of a past she had sworn never to touch again. The warehouse was as quiet as ever, the weak light from the small window casting a glow on the neatly arranged farming tools on the shelf, the worn wooden handle of a hoe, the rusty blade of a shovel, and the old plow she had fixed a few months back with the mechanical skills she learned in the army. The scent of dried grass and machine oil mingled in the cool air, bringing a familiar feeling she had learned to cherish during her years as a farmer. But today, she wasn't here for any of that. Emily walked to the corner of the shed, where a dusty wooden plank concealed a secret she had tried to bury since leaving the Green Berets. She pushed the plank aside, revealing a gray metal box locked tight with a combination lock. Kneeling down, her hands trembled slightly as she entered the birth dates of Grace and Liam, two numbers etched deep in her heart as a reminder of why she had walked away from war. The click echoed as the lock sprang open, small but sharp, like a declaration that the past was no longer at rest. Inside, the M24 sniper rifle lay snug in its foam lining, alongside a black tactical suit and several boxes of ammunition sealed in moisture-proof bags, all preserved just as they were the day she put them away after her last mission. Emily reached out and touched the gun, her fingers gliding lightly over the cold barrel, like greeting an old friend she had sworn never to see again. It felt heavier than she remembered, or maybe it was the weight of the memories that carried those long nights lying in wait on the sand dunes of the Middle East, her slow breaths sinking with a steady beat of her heart, her finger resting lightly on the trigger, and then the sharp crack that ended a threat hundreds of meters away. She picked it up, inspecting every detail with the precision of someone who had survived countless dangerous missions. The scope was still sharp, without a scratch, the stock mechanism smooth as if it had been oiled just yesterday, and each bullet in the magazine remained intact, gleaming like deadly jewels. She didn't want to use it, didn't want blood to spill on the land where she had sweated to transform into a home for Grace and Liam, but she knew that sometimes, to keep the peace, you had to be ready for war. Emily stood up, placing the gun back in the box, but not locking it away. She needed it ready, just in case those guys crossed a line she had quietly set in her mind. Stepping out of the shed, the sunlight hit her face, highlighting the small wrinkles that marked the long days spent under the sun and the sleepless nights in the military. She heard Grace calling from the backyard, the girl's voice tinged with worry, but still trying to stay calm. "Mom, Max keeps barking at the hill. I think there's something over there." Emily hurried over, seeing Grace standing by the wooden fence, pointing toward the low hill to the east, where the pines grew thick. Max stood beside her, fur bristled, barking incessantly with his ears perked up as if warning of a danger he sensed. Emily squinted, carefully scanning through the fading afternoon light. Glimpsing through the bushes, she noticed a small glint reflecting off glass or metal, something unnatural in the woods. Her heart raced, but she kept her voice steady, just like she used to reassure her teammates before a dangerous ambush. "Go inside, Grace. Call Liam too. I'll check it out." Grace nodded, darting inside with quick steps, while Emily moved closer to the fence, her hand instinctively tightening as if she were gripping a weapon on the battlefield. She crouched low, moving along the fence with the skill of a warrior trained for over 20 years in the Green Berets. As she got closer, she noticed clearer signs. A hastily extinguished cigarette, but a few blades of grass trampled down, and faint shoe prints imprinted on the dry ground, larger than those of an adult man. Someone had been here, watching the farm, watching her and the kids, perhaps since this morning or even longer. She looked up toward the hill, but that glimmer had vanished. As if the watcher realized they had been spotted, they knew how to hide, but not well enough to fool a sharpshooter who had hunted the toughest targets in the world. Emily stood tall, taking a deep breath to rein in the adrenaline surging through her veins. This was no longer just a suspicion. These strangers were not merely curious, they were hunting, and her farm was their first target in their sights. Emily Carter stood by the wooden fence of the farm, the fading afternoon sun casting a warm glow on her face, highlighting her deep blue eyes that now glinted like steel. Faint footprints on the dry ground, a crushed cigarette butt, and a few trampled blades of grass lay before her like a silent warning. Someone had been here, watching her family, and even though the light reflecting off the eastern hill had vanished, she knew they hadn't gone far. The wind rustling through the fields of wheat carried the gentle sounds of nature, but in Emily's mind, it felt like the whispers of a lurking enemy waiting for the right moment. She took a deep breath, letting the cool air of Willow Creek fill her lungs, helping her rein in the adrenaline surging within her. This was no longer just a suspicion. The strangers Hank had mentioned were targeting her, and she needed to act before they crossed the line she had quietly drawn in her heart. She returned home, her steps quick but not rushed, maintaining a calm demeanor so Grace and Liam wouldn't panic. As she pushed the door open, the smell of the fries she had tossed into the pan earlier filled the kitchen, mingling with Liam's laughter as he teased Max with an old toy bone. Grace sat on the sofa, her math book closed, now fiddling with her phone, looking bored. "Is Mom done yet?" Grace asked, looking up at her. Emily nodded, offering a gentle smile to ease the girl's skeptical gaze. "All done, sweetheart. Just a deer that ran by. Now you two stay inside with Mom for a bit, and I'll make the potato cakes like I promised." Liam cheered. "Awesome. I want extra cheese, please." Emily smiled and nodded, but as she turned back to the kitchen, that smile faded. She couldn't let the kids know that the deer she had just mentioned was actually a lurking threat out there. She stood by the stove, stirring the potatoes in the pan, but her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking about the tracks outside the fence, about the guys on motorcycles with eagle tattoos clutching guns, and about the M24 sniper rifle lying in the shed. 20 years in the Green Berets had taught her that the enemy never acts without a plan, and the way they were watching the farm showed they weren't just trying to intimidate her. They wanted to corner her, perhaps with bank debt, perhaps with violence, and they thought she was a weak single mother, an easy target to manipulate. But Emily was not someone to be easily subdued. She had faced far more dangerous foes, terrorists hiding in caves, arms dealers lurking in the shadows, and she had always been the last one standing. Now, with Grace and Liam being all she had, she couldn't afford to fail. She turned off the stove, set the frying pan of potatoes aside, and called the kids to eat. "Come on over. Your potato cakes are ready," she said, her voice gentle but with a sharpness she didn't realize. Grace and Liam ran to the dining table, with Max trotting behind, his tail wagging as if he wanted a piece too. Emily sat down with them, watching Liam stuff his mouth with potatoes and melted cheese, while Grace ate slowly, her eyes occasionally glancing at her mother. "Mom, you seem different today," Grace suddenly said, her voice small but firm. Emily paused her chewing and looked at her. "Different? What do you mean, sweetie?" "I'm just the same." Grace shrugged. "I don't know. It's just, you keep looking outside, like you're waiting for something." Emily chuckled softly, patting Grace's shoulder. "I'm just worried about the deer breaking the fence. Eat up, don't overthink it." But Grace wasn't wrong. Emily was waiting, not for a deer, but for those guys. She couldn't just sit still when they had left their mark right under her nose. After dinner, when the kids returned to the sofa to watch an old cartoon, Emily stood up, grabbed her jacket, and put on a baseball cap. "I'm stepping outside for a bit to check the fence again," she said, her voice calm. Liam nodded without taking his eyes off the screen, while Grace watched her go, her gaze filled with questions but saying nothing more. Emily stepped outside, shut the door behind her, and instantly, the calm expression on her face vanished, replaced by the sharp focus of a warrior. She turned back to the shed, this time without hesitation. She pushed the wooden plank aside, opened the metal box, and lifted the M24 once more. This time, she didn't just check it. She held it firmly, feeling the familiar weight in her hands. She attached the scope, checked the loading mechanism, and took out a box of ammunition, placing it on the shelf beside her. She didn't want to use it, but she knew that if those guys came back, words or negotiations wouldn't be enough to stop them. She had once been a ghost on the battlefield, a marksman who could take down a target from half a mile away without leaving a trace. And now, with her family threatened, she felt that warrior within her awakening deep in her chest. Emily stepped out of the shed, leaving her gun in the box, but she took a small dagger from her tactical gear, tucking it into her waistband beneath her jacket. She didn't plan to use it right away, but she needed the sense of security it provided. She walked along the fence, checking once more, and this time she spotted a new sign of thin nylon line that had been snapped, caught on the wood, as if someone had tried to set a trap or mark a spot. She knelt down, examining it more closely, and realized it wasn't random. They had come back, perhaps while she was inside, testing her reaction. Emily stood up, gazing toward the eastern hill, where the light had completely faded as the sun set. She saw nothing, but she knew they were out there, lurking in the darkness. Thinking they had the upper hand, she returned home, her footsteps light yet firm. As she walked in, Liam was slumped asleep on the sofa, while Grace was tidying up the dining table. "Are you okay, Mom?" Grace asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Emily nodded, pulling her into a quick hug. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Get to bed early. You have school tomorrow." Grace nodded, but her eyes remained glued to her mother. Emily turned off the lights, sat down in the armchair, and gazed out the window. Those guys thought she was weak, easily intimidated, but they didn't know that a warrior was rising within her. She didn't want to fight, but if they dared to threaten Grace and Liam, she would show them they had picked the wrong person to mess with. As night fell over Willow Creek, darkness enveloped Emily Carter's farm like a heavy blanket, leaving only the faint glow of the porch light spilling onto the front yard. Inside, Liam was sound asleep on the sofa, his little head resting on the pillow with a dreamy smile, while Grace sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read a book, her gaze drifting out the window where their mother had just stepped in after checking the fence. Max lay stretched out on the floor, his ears twitching at every gust of wind, as if the dog could sense the tension hanging in the air. Emily stood at the threshold, her hand still gripping the knife tucked under her coat, her deep blue eyes scanning the room to ensure the kids were safe. The snapped nylon line caught on the fence, a fresh mark she had just discovered, lingered hauntingly in her mind. Those strangers weren't just watching. They were testing her, pushing her to her limits. And now, she knew that the peaceful moment she was trying to protect for Grace and Liam was about to shatter. She stepped inside, closed the door with a soft click, and hung her coat on the hook, carefully hiding the knife so the kids wouldn't see it. "Is Liam asleep?" she asked, her voice gentle as if nothing had happened. Grace nodded, got up, and walked over to the sofa, pulling a blanket over her little brother. "Yeah, he fell asleep right when the movie ended. Mom, are you sure you're okay?" Grace asked, her voice small but filled with concern, her sharp gaze seeming to pierce through the calm facade Emily was trying to maintain. Emily smiled, walked over, and gave Grace a quick hug. "I'm fine, sweetheart. I just wanted to check on everything a little more closely. Go to bed, you have school tomorrow." Grace nodded, but the way she looked at her mom before heading upstairs showed she wasn't entirely convinced by that simple explanation. When Grace disappeared upstairs, Emily turned off the living room lights, leaving only the dim glow from the kitchen. She sank into the armchair, gazing out the window at the darkness enveloping the wheat fields. Max trotted over to her, resting his head on her lap, his brown eyes shining with the loyalty she always relied on. "You know too, don't you?" she whispered, stroking the dog's head. Max let out a soft whine, as if in agreement, and Emily felt a warm wave wash over the tension in her heart. But that warmth wasn't enough to erase the reality. Those guys were out there, and the broken nylon cord was proof they were closer than she thought. They weren't just an ordinary motorcycle gang. The way they moved, the way they left deliberate traces, all bore the marks of training maybe not as skilled as hers, but enough to make her take them seriously. She stood up, walked into the kitchen, and poured a glass of cold water, but instead of picking it up, She set it down on the table, her gaze lost in the void. Memories from her days in the Green Beret flooded back. Not like a tidal wave, but like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together. She remembered the nights lying in ambush in the woods, her breath so slow it was almost at a standstill, her eyes glued to the scope, waiting for a target that would never know death was creeping closer. She recalled the whispers of her teammates over the radio, the wind howling through the dust, and the sharp crack of the M24 when she pulled the trigger. 2,117 kills. That number wasn't a badge of honor. It was a burden she carried in every dream, every time she jolted awake from a tiny sound in the night. She had left it all behind to become a mother, so Grace and Liam would never have to know that world. But now, that world was knocking at her door. Emily returned to the shed for the third time that day, this time with quicker, more determined steps. The moonlight streamed through the small window, illuminating the open metal box. She picked up the M24, not just to inspect it, but to feel its weight, its balance, the coldness of the metal in her hands. She attached the scope, checked the loading mechanism once more, and took a box of ammunition, opening it to count each bullet. Each round was a reminder of what she had done and what she might have to do again. She didn't want blood spilled on this land, didn't want the kids to see their mother turn into someone they wouldn't recognize. But as she thought of Grace and Liam, of Liam's smile and Grace's sharp gaze, she knew she would do anything to protect them, even if it meant picking up a gun once more. She put the gun back in the box, but this time she brought it inside, hiding it under the couch in the living room, where she could grab it quickly if needed. She didn't lock the box. There was no time for hesitation anymore. When she returned to the armchair, Max was still lying beside her, his ears perked up as if waiting for a command. She sat down, gazing out the window, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself to fully feel the awakening of the warrior within. It didn't come as a surge of anger or fear, but as a cold clarity, the clarity of someone who has faced death and survived. Those guys thought she was a weak single mother, a farmer struggling with debt, but they didn't know she was a former Green Beret, a sharpshooter who had turned the most overconfident of men into corpses before they even realized what was happening. From a distance, she heard the engine a low rumble, but enough to make Max growl. She stood up, walked a window, and peered into the darkness. A motorcycle zipped down the road leading to the farm, its headlights sweeping across the fields before disappearing. They were scouting, probing, and this time they weren't hiding their intentions. Emily turned back to look at Liam, still sound asleep on the sofa, and thought about Grace upstairs. This was a reason she had left the war behind, to give them a peaceful life. But now, as those guys dared to threaten her family, she felt the warrior within her not just awaken, but ready to take action. She sat down again, her hand resting on Max's head, feeling the warmth from her loyal dog. "We're going to protect the kids, right?" she whispered, and Max let out a soft whine in agreement. Emily looked out the window, her eyes shining with determination. Those guys might think they had the upper hand, that they could force her to submit with threats or violence. But they didn't know that she had once been a ghost, a nightmare to her enemies, and if they dared to step over this threshold, she would show them that a mother willing to fight for her children is a danger they could never anticipate. The darkness enveloped Willow Creek as Emily Carter sat in the living room, the dim light from the kitchen casting a glow on her face, highlighting her deep blue eyes now filled with determination. Liam was still sound asleep on the sofa, his steady breathing echoing in the quiet space, while Grace had gone upstairs, likely still wondering why her mother was so tense. Max lay by Emily's feet, his ears perked up, brown eyes alert as he stared out the window where a motorcycle had just zipped by moments ago. The sound of the engine faded away, but it left her with a chilling sense not of fear, but certainty that those strangers were no longer just probing. They were preparing to act, and Emily knew she couldn't face them alone, even though she had been a Green Beret sharpshooter with 2,117 confirmed kills. This wasn't a battlefield in the Middle East or South America. This was her home, and she needed more than just a gun to protect it. She stood up, moving lightly so as not to wake Liam, and walked over to the window. Through the dusty glass, she looked out at the wheat fields, now just a sea of darkness swaying in the wind. The M24 was hidden under the bed, ready for any situation. But Emily understood that true strength didn't just lie in weapons. Those guys with eagle tattoos clutching guns, and their calculated movements weren't your average thugs. They were more numerous, more organized, and they might have been planning this for a long time. Alone, no matter how skilled she was, she couldn't protect Grace and Liam forever if they decided to launch a full-on attack. She needed allies, people willing to stand up with her, and fortunately, Willow Creek wasn't just a small town. It was a tight-knit community where folks were always ready to help each other when trouble came knocking. She turned back to the kitchen, poured a cup of cold coffee from the pot she made this morning, and sat down at the table, her mind starting to plan. Hank was the first person she thought of. The frail old man at the diner wasn't just a coffee seller. He had been a hunter, surviving the brutal winters of Wyoming with skill and courage. He had warned her about the strange man, and the worried look in his eyes showed that he wasn't just curious, he cared. Emily took a sip of her coffee, feeling the bitterness slide down her throat, and decided that tomorrow morning she would go see Hank. Not just to ask for more information, but to enlist his help in spreading the warning around town. If she could get people to pay attention, maybe they would stand with her against this threat. The moonlight streamed to the window, casting a glow on her hand, resting on the table, a hand that once held a sniper rifle with deadly precision, now calloused from years of working the land. She smiled faintly, thinking of the others in Willow Creek. There was Ellie, the elderly neighbor who lived a few miles from the farm, a tiny but tough old woman who used to tell stories about how she faced down a pack of wolves to protect her chickens. Then there was Tom, the mechanic in town, a veteran with a prosthetic leg from the war in Afghanistan. He was quiet, but Emily had seen him handle a wrench with the agility of someone who had never left the service. These people, though ordinary, carried a strength she knew she could tap into. She didn't need an army. She needed a community, and Willow Creek could become that if she could convince them. She stood up, stepped out onto the porch, and let the night breeze brush against her face. Max scampered after her, standing beside her with his ears perked up as if waiting for orders. Emily gazed out at the hill to the east, where she had seen the glimmer of light reflecting and the traces of the enemy. She had fought alone before, hiding in the shadows to take out her targets, but this time was different. Grace and Liam weren't just reasons for her to pick up a gun. They were reasons for her to seek help, to place her trust in those around her. She took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill her lungs, and in that moment, she felt a flicker of hope break through the tension. Those guys might be more numerous, stronger, but they didn't understand the true power of a small town like Willow Creek, the strength of ordinary people when they stand together. She turned back into the house, checked on Liam one more time, and headed upstairs to see Grace. The little girl was asleep, a book fallen beside her pillow, her brown hair spread out over the blanket. Emily stood in the doorway, watching her daughter, and felt her heart tighten. Grace was smart, perceptive, and sometimes a girl reminded her of herself when she was young, but she didn't want Grace to grow up in fear or violence. She walked over, pulled the blanket up around Grace, and whispered, "Mom will keep everything okay, sweetie." As she turned to head back downstairs, Max was still standing at the staircase, his eyes on her as if to say he wouldn't leave her side for a moment. Emily settled back into the armchair, her hand resting on Max's head as she gazed out the window once more. She wasn't going to sleep tonight. She knew those guys would come back, maybe with more people, more weapons. But she also knew she wasn't alone. Tomorrow morning, she would meet with Hank, then Ellie, then Tom, and anyone else willing to listen. She would tell them about the strangers, about the tracks outside the fence, and she would ask if they wanted to protect this town not just for her, but for themselves, for their families. She had once been a lone warrior, but now she realized that true strength didn't lie in the gun in her hand, but in the people willing to stand by her when the storm rolled in. She closed her eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to focus. Those guys thought they were hunting a weak prey, a single mother with a failing farm. But they didn't know that Emily was not just a former Green Beret. She was part Willow Creek, and if she could ignite the spirit of this town, they would soon realize they weren't just up against a woman. They were facing an entire community that wouldn't back down easily. She opened her eyes, gazed into the darkness, and smiled faintly. The storm was coming, but this time, she wouldn't be fighting alone. The brilliant dawn spilled over the wheat fields of Willow Creek, casting a warm golden light over Emily Carter's farm. as if trying to chase away the heavy shadows of the night before. The crowing of the rooster from the coop behind the house blended with Max's soft barking as Emily stepped out onto the front porch, cradling a steaming cup of freshly brewed coffee. She hadn't slept much, just dozing off for a few hours in the armchair, always keeping her ears tuned for any sounds from outside. Liam was still sound asleep on the sofa when she left the living room, while Grace had woken up early, her familiar scowl of a teenager who despised early mornings as she herded the chickens. Emily stood on the porch, taking a deep breath of the fresh Wyoming morning air, feeling a flicker of hope pierce through the tension. Those strangers might be lurking, but today, she wouldn't let them dictate the pace of this battle. She would seek allies, and Willow Creek would be where she began. She called Grace into the house, setting the coffee cup down on the porch. "Grace, I'm going to town for a bit. You stay here with Liam, lock the door tight, and if you see anything strange, call me right away, okay?" Grace nodded, her messy brown hair blowing in the wind, her sharp little eyes flickering with a hint of worry, but she didn't ask any more questions. "I know, Mom. Be careful, okay?" Emily smiled, ruffling the girl's hair. "I'm always careful." She turned back to glance at Liam through the window. He was still asleep, clutching his pillow like a little superhero, and her heart felt warm yet heavy. She didn't want the kids to worry, but she couldn't hide things from them forever. Grace was old enough to sense danger, and Liam, though innocent, needed to learn how to protect himself. She stepped down the porch, climbed into the old pickup truck, and drove toward downtown, determined to turn last night's thoughts into action. Hank's diner was as bustling as ever that morning, the smell of toasted bread and sizzling bacon filling the air as Emily pushed the door open. The bell jingled, and Hank looked up from the counter, his sharp eyes lighting up beneath his shock of white hair when he saw her. "Early this morning, huh, Emily?" he said, wiping his hands on a rag and pouring her a cup of coffee. Without even asking, Emily settled onto her familiar stool, nodding her thanks, but she didn't take a sip of the coffee right away. "Hank, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice low but firm. Hank frowned, leaning in closer, a hint of worry flickering in his gaze. "About those guys from last night? I saw a motorcycle zoom past here late. Didn't stop, but I bet it was them." Emily nodded, gripping her coffee cup tightly. "They didn't just pass by. I found traces outside the tobacco fence, footprints, and a snapped nylon line. They're watching my farm, Hank, and I think they won't stop there." Hank sat down in the chair across from her, his weathered face creased with tension. "Oh, God. Emily, what do you think they want? Your farm? Or something bigger?" Emily shrugged, but her gaze was sharp. "I'm not sure, but they know I owe the bank, and they seem organized. I can't let them get close to Grace and Liam. Hank, I need you to help me warn everyone in town." Hank nodded slowly, tapping his fingers on the counter as he thought. "You're right. If they're targeting you, they'll go after others too, those small farms, the struggling shops. I'll talk to everyone, but you need more than just a warning. You need someone to stand with you." Emily gave a faint smile, feeling a sense of relief for the first time that day. "That's exactly why I came here. Do you know anyone who will listen?" Hank chuckled softly, his eyes lighting up like an old hunter reminiscing about his glory days. "Let me handle this. You go meet with Ellie. She may be small, but she's tough as nails. She's taken down a whole pack of wolves with a gun. And then there's Tom at the garage. That kid used to be a soldier. He lost a leg in Afghanistan, but I bet he could still take down a few guys if it came to that." Emily nodded, committing every name to memory. "Thank you, Hank. I'll go see them right away." She stood up, leaving a few dollars on the counter, but Hank pushed them back. "Let me take care of the coffee. You need your strength to deal with those bastards." Emily smiled, nodded, and stepped outside, feeling like a ray of sunshine had just broken to the dark clouds in her heart. Her pickup truck came to a stop in front of Mrs. Ellie's house, a small wooden cottage a few miles from the farm, with a faded white picket fence and a few wilted flower pots baking in the sun. Mrs. Ellie was sitting in a rocking chair on the porch, her bony hands cradling a cup of tea, her sharp eyes peering out from beneath her silver hair as Emily stepped out of the truck. "Hello, Emily," she called, her voice raspy yet warm. "You look more stressed than usual this morning. What's going on?" Emily walked over and sat down on the steps beside her. "Mrs. Ellie, I need your help. There are some strange guys targeting my farm. They've been leaving tracks and riding their motorcycles back and forth. I think they want more than just me. They're after this whole town." Mrs. Ellie took a sip of her tea, set the cup down, and smirked. "Those punks, huh? I used to chase off a whole pack of wolves with a shotgun when I was younger. If they dare come here, I'll show them this old lady isn't someone to mess with." Emily smiled, feeling Mrs. Ellie's toughness like a refreshing breeze on a hot day. "I have no doubt about that, ma'am. But I need you to tell the others who you know will stand up, okay?" Mrs. Ellie nodded, her eyes lighting up. "Leave it to me. I'll call up some of my old friends and a few of the farmers nearby. We're not going to let them do whatever they want." Emily stood up, giving her a light pat on the shoulder. "Thank you. I'm going to see Tom now, and then I'll be back." Mrs. Ellie nodded, lifting her teacup. "Go on, girl. And if you need it, I still have my hunting rifle in the shed." As Emily got into the car, she felt a surge of new energy coursing through her. Hank and Ellie weren't just neighbors. They were the kind of people ready to stand up when the town was threatened. She drove toward Tom's garage, her heart filled with hope. Those strangers might think they were hunting a lone prey, but they had no idea that Emily was turning Willow Creek into an army not with guns, but with the spirit of ordinary people ready to protect one another. She smiled, gripping the steering wheel tightly. A storm was coming, but this time she had an entire town behind her. The morning in Willow Creek was still radiant under the golden sunlight, but as Emily Carter drove her old pickup truck away from Grandma Ellie's house, she felt a surge of new energy coursing through her, not the adrenaline of battle, but a belief in the people around her. Hank had agreed to spread the warning. Grandma Ellie had promised to rally the tough neighbors, and now her next stop was Tom's garage, where she hoped to find another ally to face the strangers threatening her farm and the town. The engine rumbled along the dirt road, dust swirling behind, but in Emily's heart, for the first time since discovering the tracks outside the fence, she didn't feel alone. Those guys might be more numerous and organized, but they didn't understand that Willow Creek was not just a piece of land. It was a community, and she was igniting its strength. Tom's garage sat on the outskirts of town, a low building with a rusty metal roof and stacks of old tires piled high outside. As Emily parked and stepped out, she heard the clinking of wrenches against metal and caught a whiff of engine oil in the air. Tom was bent over a broken-down truck, his work jacket smeared with grease, and his prosthetic leg visible beneath the cuff of his jeans. He looked up at the sound of footsteps, his brown eyes shining with curiosity beneath his short hair. "Emily," he said, his voice deep yet friendly, wiping his hands on an old rag. "What brings you here this morning? Is your car acting up again?" Emily shook her head, moving closer and taking a seat on a nearby plastic chair. "It's not the car, Tom. I need to talk to you about something serious." Tom furrowed his brow, set the wrench down, and sat across from her, his prosthetic leg creaking slightly as he moved. "From the sound of your voice, this isn't a small matter. What's going on?" Emily took a deep breath, looking straight into his eyes. "There are some strange guys targeting my farm. They left behind cigarette butts, nylon rope, shoe prints, and last night a motorcycle sped past my house. They're not just ordinary folks, Tom. I think they're organized, and they might be aiming for more than just me. They could be after this whole town." Tom fell silent for a moment, lightly tapping his knee. Then he smirked, not a joyful smile, but the kind of grin from someone who's seen enough in life. "You're talking like back when I was in Afghanistan. What do they want? Money? Land?" Emily shrugged, but her gaze never left him. "I'm not sure, but they know I owe the bank, and they move like they're trained. I can't let them get close to Grace and Liam. Tom, Hank and Mrs. Ellie have agreed to help me warn everyone. But I need you. You were a soldier. You understand this better than anyone." Tom nodded slowly, a distant memory flickering in his eyes. "I lost this leg to mine over there, but I still know how to fight. If they dare to come here, I won't let you face them alone. Emily, do you have a plan?" Emily smiled, feeling another spark of hope ignite within her. "I wanted to think they're only facing me, but when they come, the whole town will rise up. Can you help me organize it?" Tom stood up, walked over to the tool rack, and pulled out an old handgun, checking it with the skill of a seasoned veteran. "I can do more than that. I know a few of my old buddies who served, and they've been farming nearby lately. I'll call them, and if those bastards show up, they won't know what hit them." Emily stood up and patted his shoulder. "Thank you, Tom. I know I can trust you." Tom nodded, his eyes lighting up like a soldier who had just found his purpose again. "You don't need to thank me. This is my home, too, Emily. If they want to cause trouble, then they'll find themselves in trouble." As Emily left the garage, the sun was higher in the sky, illuminating the road leading to the farm. She drove slowly, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. Hank, Ellie, Tom, the first three she reached out to, and all three didn't hesitate to stand by her side. She thought of the others in Willow Creek. Mr. Joe at the grocery store, who used to tell stories about chasing off horse thieves with a machete, Ms. Mary at the school, a tough single mom just like her, and the old farmers who gather at Hank's place every morning. They weren't an army, not Green Berets, but they were ordinary folks with fierce determination, and Emily knew that if she could rally them together, those strangers wouldn't stand a chance. She arrived at the farm just as the sun was starting to set, parked the car, and walked into the house. Grace was in the kitchen, making a sandwich for Liam, while the little boy ran around with Max, laughing and playing as if nothing was wrong. "Where have you been, Mom?" Grace asked, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Emily sat down at the table, took a piece of sandwich from Grace's plate, and took a bite. "I ran into a few people in town. Honey, everything's fine, don't worry." Grace nodded, but the way she looked at her mother showed that she still sensed something was off. After finishing her food, Emily stood up and looked out the window. She hadn't told the kids about Hank, Ellie, or Tom yet. She wanted them to hold on to this carefree moment a little longer before things got more complicated. She stepped out into the backyard, gazing at the hill to the east, where the scars of the enemy still lingered. Those guys might be watching right now, thinking they were hunting a weak target, a single mother with a failing farm. But they didn't know that Emily was no longer alone. Hank would spread the word warning. Ellie would rally the tough neighbors, and Tom would bring his combat experience into fight. She smiled, gripping the porch railing tightly. She had once been a lone warrior, but now she was part of Willow Creek, and the true strength of this community was beginning to rise not with gunfire, but through the unity of people ready to protect each other when darkness fell. Emily turned back to look at Grace and Liam through the window, her two kids being the reason she did all of this. She wasn't just fighting for the farm or for herself. She was fighting for them, for this town, and for those who had chosen to stand by her. Those strangers might think they had the upper hand, but they were about to learn a bitter lesson. When a small community like Willow Creek comes together, no enemy is strong enough to bring them down. The sky over Willow Creek turned a brilliant orange as the sun set, casting a warm yet ominous hue over Emily Carter's wheat fields. Inside the wooden house, the peaceful atmosphere of the afternoon had vanished, replaced by a quiet tension that both Grace and Liam could feel, even if they didn't speak of it. Grace sat at the kitchen table, pretending to read a book, but her gaze kept drifting to the window, where Emily stood on the porch, gripping the railing tightly, her deep blue eyes scanning the hills to the east. Liam played with Max on the floor, tossing a tennis ball back and forth, but the boy's laughter was no longer carefree. It was interrupted, as if he too was waiting for something. Emily knew she couldn't hide it from him forever, not when those strangers had left their mark, riding their motorcycles back and forth, and now she sensed that the moment of confrontation was drawing closer than ever. She turned into the house, gently closed the door, and sat down next to Liam. "You played really well with Max," she said, stroking the boy's head. Try and keep her voice soft. Liam beamed. "Max is a superhero, Mom. He'll protect us, right?" Emily nodded, but her gaze drifted to Grace, who was looking at her with an unmistakable suspicion. "Mom, you keep looking outside," Grace said, her voice small but firm. "Something's really going on, isn't it?" Emily took a deep breath, knowing it was time to share part of the truth. "There are some bad people hanging around lately, Grace. I just want to make sure you're safe. But I'm not alone, Mr. Hank. Mrs. Ellie and Tom, along with many others, will help me. You don't need to worry." Grace nodded slowly, her eyes showing a hint of relief, but Liam jumped up. "Like a superhero team, right, Mom? I want to help too. Emily laughed, pulling the boy into her arms. You can help me by staying close to Grace and Max, okay? Liam nodded eagerly. But in Emily's heart, she knew that her superhero team was about to face a challenge bigger than they could imagine. She stood up, walked to the window once more, and this time she heard the roar of engines in the distance. Not just one, but many motorcycles, echoing through the valley like the growl of a pack of wild beasts. Max's fur bristled, barking incessantly, his ears perked up towards the sound. Emily turned around, her voice sharp. Grace, take Liam upstairs right now. Stay there with Max until I call for you. Grace didn't ask any more questions, grabbing Liam's hand and racing up the stairs, with Max trotting closely behind. Barking a few more times as if to warn them, Emily approached the cupboard, pulled out the metal box containing the M24, and this time she didn't hesitate. She attached the scope, loaded the ammunition, and held it in her hands with the familiarity of a warrior who had survived countless missions. She didn't want blood to spill on this land, but if those guys dared to come near Grace and Liam, she wouldn't give them a chance to step over the threshold. She stepped out into the front yard, a sniper rifle hidden beneath her long coat, and stood still, waiting. The sound of engines grew closer, and then she saw them 5 sleek black motorcycles emerging from the road, leading into the farm, dust swirling behind them. The riders wore leather jackets and helmets that concealed their faces, but from the way they moved slowly and deliberately, Emily sensed they weren't just random thugs. One man led the pack, tall and scarred, his face revealed as he removed his helmet, stopping his bike a few dozen feet away from her. He smirked, his cold gaze sweeping over the farm as if he owned it. Beautiful place you've got here, he said, his voice deep yet menacing. It'd be a shame if something happened to it, wouldn't it, single mother? Emily stood tall, her hand gripping the gun hidden beneath her shirt, but her voice was calm like a lake before a storm. This is private property. You're not welcome here. Turn around while you still can. The scarred man let out a loud laugh, the sound echoing in the quiet of the late afternoon. You don't get it. We don't ask for permission. We're here to take this farm, and anything else we want. The bank is about to seize it, right? We're just here to lighten your load. He gestured, and the 4 other men got out of the car, wielding iron rods and knives, confidently advancing toward her like they were sure of their victory. But then, from the back of the farm, another engine roared to life, not a motorcycle, but the familiar sound of a truck. Tom's rusty red pickup came barreling in, skidding to a stop beside Emily as he stepped out with a handgun in hand. His prosthetic leg didn't diminish the tough demeanor of a seasoned veteran. I think you need some backup, Tom said, his sharp gaze fixed on the group of bikers. The scarred man frowned, but his grin didn't fade. What's a cripple gonna do? He sneered. But before he could say more, a gunshot rang out from a distance, not from Emily or Tom, but from the direction of Mrs. Ellie's house. A bullet whizzed past the ground near the scarred man's feet, startling him, and then Mrs. Ellie emerged from the thicket nearby, her old shotgun resting on her shoulder, her eyes shining like a seasoned hunter. Don't underestimate this old lady, you bastard, Ellie growled, her voice raspy yet powerful. The scarred man took a step back, a flicker of confusion in his eyes, but he quickly regained his composure. So what if there are 3 of you? We're more. We're stronger. Just give up while you still can. Emily stepped forward, her M24 still hidden, her tone as cold as ice. You're mistaken. It's not just 3 of us. From the direction of the town, the sound of more vehicles echoed Hank's truck and a few pickups. Carrying the farmers and neighbors Emily had rallied through Hank and Ellie. They got out of the vehicles, armed with hoes, shovels, and a few shotguns, their expressions not those of fear, but people ready to defend their home. The scarred man looked around, his smile fading as he saw dozens of Willow Creek residents surrounding the farm. Emily stepped closer, her gaze locked onto him. You think I'm just a weak single mom, don't you? But this is Willow Creek, and we don't let anyone take what's ours. The scarred man gritted his teeth, his hand tightening around the knife, but his eyes wavered. He never expected that the prey he targeted would have an entire town standing behind her. Emily felt her heart pounding, not out of fear, but from pride. She had once been a lone warrior, but now she was part of something bigger, a community, ready to fight for one another. The confrontation had only just begun, but she knew that with Willow Creek by her side, these guys would soon realize they had picked the wrong opponent to mess with. The sky over Willow Creek had turned a deep purple as the standoff at Emily Carter's farm reached its most intense moment. The dust from the motorcycles of the scarred man and his crew still hung in the air, but the initial confidence on his face had now given way to confusion. He stood there, gripping a knife tightly, his gaze sweeping over the dozens of Willow Creek residents surrounding Hank's farm skinny but determined hands of Mrs. Ellie with an old shotgun resting on her shoulder, Tom with a pistol and a prosthetic leg that didn't dampen his spirit, and other farmers and neighbors wielding hoes and shovels ready to defend their land. Emily stood among them, her M24 still hidden beneath her coat, her voice cold and clear in the stillness before the storm. You have one last choice: leave right now, or face the consequences. The scar man laughed loudly, but that laughter lacked the confidence it once had. It was forced, like a last-ditch effort to save face. You think these old folks can scare me? He roared, signaling to his goons. You heard her, a single mother and a bunch of country bumpkins. Take care of them. The other four stepped forward, their iron rods and knives glinting in the sunset, but before they could advance too far, a gunshot rang out from Ellie's shotgun, the bullet whizzing past the ground right in front of one of them, causing him to stumble and fall. Take one more step, and I won't be shooting at the ground, Ellie growled, her voice hoarse yet powerful, her eyes shining like a seasoned hunter who just spotted her prey. Tom stepped up next to Emily, his handgun aimed squarely at the scarred man, his gaze as sharp as it had been back in Afghanistan. You're not alone, Emily. If they want to cause trouble, they'll have to get through me first. Hank moved up from behind, wielding a pickaxe, his eyes not the kind of coffee seller, but a man who had survived the brutal winters of Wyoming. And they'll have to get through me too, he said, his voice deep but steady. The others, Joe from the grocery store, Mary from the school, and a few old farmers also stepped forward, forming a tight circle around the bikers. They weren't soldiers, not trained like Emily or Tom, but their eyes spoke volumes. This was their home, and they wouldn't let anyone take it away. The scarred man gritted his teeth, his gaze flickering between anger and confusion. You think we're scared? He shouted, but his voice trembled, and Emily noticed it. She took another step forward, her hand still hiding the M24, her voice calm yet sharp as a knife. It's not about being scared or not. You don't have what it takes. Look around. This isn't just one person. It's an entire town. What do you want? Land? Money? You won't get anything from here. The scar man smirked, but that smile was now just a grimace. He signaled to his goons, and one of them, a tall guy with long hair, stepped forward, holding a gas can and a lighter. If we can't take it, we'll burn it, he said, his voice raspy as he flicked the lighter, a small flame flaring up in his hand. Emily felt her heart racing, not out of fear, but because a surge of anger was rising within her. She had seen scenes like this before: villages burned to ground in war, families losing everything due to the cruelty of others. But this time, she wasn't in the Middle East or South America. She was in Willow Creek, and she had an entire community standing behind her. Before the long-haired guy could throw the Molotov cocktail, another gunshot rang out, this time from Tom. The bullet struck the gas bottle in his hand, shattering it and sending gasoline splattering all over him. Igniting instantly, he screamed, rolling on the ground, put out the flames, while the others panicked and backed away. That's a warning, Tom said, his voice deep but commanding. Next time, I won't be shooting at the bottle. The scarred man shouted, rage flooding his scarred face. Do you all want to die? We didn't come here alone. He pulled a walkie-talkie from his pocket and yelled into it, Everyone, get here now! From the eastern hill, the roar of engines erupted again, and 6 more motorcycles appeared, kicking up a cloud of dust as they raced down. Emily quickly counted 11 men, all armed from knives to iron rods, and a few even had handguns. The people of Willow Creek wavered for a moment, some stepping back, but Emily raised her hand, her voice ringing out like a command. Stay still. We outnumber them, and we're on our home turf. Don't let them win with fear. Hank stepped up, the shovel raised high in his hands. You think we're just going to let you burn down our homes? Come on, give it a try. Mrs. Ellie loaded a fresh round into her shotgun, sneering, I may be old, but I can still hit a target from 100 yards, you bastards." Tom stood next to Emily, his eyes glued to the approaching motorcycles. "Do you have a plan?" he whispered. Emily nodded, slowly pulling the M24 out from her jacket, hiding it behind her back. "I'll distract them. You and the others hold your ground. If I shoot, aim for my legs. I don't want too much bloodshed, but they need to know they can't win." Tom nodded, a hint of admiration in his gaze. "You're truly a soldier, Emily." The new motorcycles roared in, stopping next to the scarred man, and now there were more than 11 guys facing off against dozens of the Willow Creek residents. The scarred man laughed loudly, regaining his confidence. "So, what now, single mom? You and these country bumpkins still want play?" But before he could give the order, Emily stepped forward, her M24 now visible in her hands. The barrel pointed at the ground, but her gaze locked onto the scarred man. "I'm not playing," she said, her voice as cold as ice. "I used to be a Green Beret, and I've taken down thousands like you without breaking a sweat. This is my home, and these people are my family. Take one more step, and you won't get a chance to take another." The scarred man hesitated, his gaze wavering as he looked at the sniper rifle in Emily's hands. He never expected that a single mother with a failing farm would turn out to be a veteran wielding a deadly weapon. His lackeys also stepped back, a few whispering among themselves, clearly reluctant to face a trained marksman like Emily. But the scarred man gritted his teeth and raised his knife. "Are you bluffing me? I don't believe you'd actually shoot," he shouted, signaling to his crew. "Charge and burn it all down." Emily raised the M24, her finger lightly resting on the trigger, but she didn't pull it. She knew that a single shot could ignite a bloody battle, and she didn't want that not with Grace and Liam upstairs. But she also knew she wasn't alone. Tom, Hank, Ellie, and the entire town stood behind her, ready to fight. The standoff had reached its peak, and now everything hinged on the next moment, whether the scar man would back down, or if Willow Creek would have to bleed to defend itself. If your heart beats faster when Emily and all of Willow Creek stand up against the darkness, when ordinary people become heroes through love and unity, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel. This story belongs to all of us, and we need you to help spread that power. Thank you. The darkness enveloped Willow Creek, with only the faint moonlight illuminating Emily Carter's farm, highlighting the shadowy figures of 11 bikers facing off against dozens of townsfolk. The scarred man stood at the center of his gang, a knife glinting in his hand, his scarred face twisted in rage as Emily raised her M24, her finger resting lightly on the trigger, her cold gaze locked onto him. Tom stood beside her, his handgun aimed straight ahead, his prosthetic leg in no way diminishing the fierce presence of a veteran. Behind them, Mrs. Ellie had reloaded her shotgun, her eyes shining like those of a seasoned hunter. Hank gripped his hoe tightly, and the other townspeople, Mr. Joe, Sister Mary, and several farmers formed a solid circle, their expressions not those of fear, but determination to protect their home. The scarred man shouted, his voice trembling with anger, "Charge and burn it all down." But before his gang could rush forward, Emily pulled the trigger. The sound of the M24 rifle cracked through the air, sharp and brief, echoing across the valley like a declaration. The bullet didn't hit anyone. Instead, it struck the gas tank of the motorcycle closest to the scarred man, igniting it in an instant. Flames shot up high, illuminating the panicked faces of his crew. One guy screamed, leaping off his bike as the fire spread to his shirt, while the others recoiled, trembling with their bats and knives. The scarred man turned to Emily, his eyes a mix of rage and fear. "You actually dare to shoot?" he barked, but his voice faltered, and Emily realized he was losing control. She lowered the gun, no longer aiming it directly at him, but her gaze remained locked on him. "That was a warning," she said, her voice icy. "Next time, I won't shoot at the bike." Tom stepped forward, his handgun still aimed at the scarred man, his gaze icy. "You heard her. Get lost, or we'll make you regret coming here." Mrs. Ellie scoffed, loading another bullet into her shotgun. "I may be old, but I can still hit your eye from a distance, so don't test me." Hank raised his pickaxe, his voice deep but commanding. "This is our home. You don't stand a chance." The people of Willow Creek took a collective step forward, the sound of shovels and picks clashing together ringing out like a battle anthem. And for the first time, Emily saw the confidence on the scarred man's face completely vanish. He looked around, realizing that his crew no longer wanted to charge in. A few had backed away toward the truck, panic in her eyes as the flames from the burning motorcycle spread to the dry grass. The scarred man gritted his teeth, gripping the knife so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "You think you've won, huh?" he shouted, his voice wavering with anger and fear. "We'll be back, more of us, stronger. You and this rundown town will burn to ashes." But before he could do anything else, another sound echoed from afar, the wail of police sirens. Red and blue lights flashed from the road leading to the farm, and 2 patrol cars barreled in, kicking up a cloud of dust. The car doors swung open, and Sheriff Jim, the chief of police in Willow Creek, stepped out, gun in hand, his gaze sweeping over the group of bikers. "I got a call from Hank," he said, his voice deep but commanding. "Who are you, and what the hell are you doing on Miss Carter's property?" The scarred man stepped back, his gaze flickering between Emily and Mr. Jim. "This isn't your business, cop," he shouted, but Mr. Jim stepped forward, gun still aimed straight at him. "When you threaten the folks in my town, it becomes my business. Drop your weapons, or I'll arrest every last one of you right now." The scarred man's henchmen exchanged glances, some of them dropping their knives and bats to the ground, clearly not wanting to face an entire town and the police. The scarred man yelled, anger boiling over. "What are you doing? Get up!" But no one listened to him anymore. One long-haired guy, who had been doused in gasoline earlier, mumbled, "I don't want to die over this," and climbed onto his motorcycle, starting the engine. Emily stepped forward, the M24 still in her hands, her voice ringing out like a final command. "You've lost. Go on and don't look back." The scarred man glared at her, his eyes filled with hatred, but he knew he had no choice left. He turned to his gang, shouting, "Get in the car, let's move." The motorcycles roared to life, the engines growling as they turned around, speeding off into the dust and darkness, leaving the smoldering wreck behind. The scarred man was the last to leave, but before disappearing, he turned back and shouted, "This isn't over, girl. You'll regret this." Emily didn't respond. She just stood still, watching until the last taillight vanished from sight. Mr. Jim stepped up to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay, Emily? I came as soon as Hank called." Emily nodded, lowering her gun, the adrenaline slowly fading away. "Thank you, Jim. But it's not just me. It's all of us." She turned to look at the people of Willow Creek, who stood there, holding makeshift weapons but with eyes full of determination. Tom smirked, putting his gun away. "They have no idea what they just poked at, do they?" Mrs. Ellie laughed heartily, patting Emily on the back. "You did great, girl. They won't dare come back." Hank stepped forward, the hose still in his hand. "If they do, they'll face this whole town again." Emily looked around, feeling a warm wave wash over her. She had once thought she had to fight alone, but Willow Creek had proven her wrong. They weren't just protecting her farm. They were protecting themselves, their families, and this land. She walked into the house, calling for Grace and Liam to come down. The 2 kids came running out, with Max bounding after them, and Grace threw her arms around her. "Are you okay, Mom? I heard gunshots." Liam jumped in. "Did you chase the bad guys away, Mom? You're awesome." Emily laughed, hugging them both tightly. "I'm fine, and so are you. I didn't chase them away. It was everyone out there." She led the kids out to the porch, where the people of Willow Creek were gathering, laughing and patting each other on the back like they had just won a battle. Mr. Jim stood next to the patrol car, jotting down notes, but there was a glimmer of pride in his eyes as he looked at the crowd. Emily glanced at Hank, Ellie, Tom, and everyone else, realizing that this confrontation was not just a victory over the scarred guy. It was a testament to the strength of community, something she couldn't have when fighting alone in the Green Berets. Those guys might come back, bigger and stronger, but now she knew that Willow Creek would never back down. She hugged Grace and Liam a little tighter, smiling. The storm had passed, but if it came back, they would be ready not just her, but a whole town standing behind her. The sky over Willow Creek lit up with a brilliant sunrise, casting a warm golden glow over Emily Carter's farm, like a welcoming embrace after the storm. Last night, the roar of motorcycle engines had faded into the darkness, leaving behind a smoldering wreck on the ground and the chaotic remnants of a confrontation. Emily stood on the porch, holding a steaming cup of coffee, her deep blue eyes gazing out at the now peaceful wheat fields. Grace and Liam were still asleep inside. Grace curled up under the blankets on the second floor, while Liam held Max tightly on the sofa, their steady breathing bringing her a sense of relief she hadn't felt in days. The people of Willow Creek had left after the scarred man and his gang retreated, but the air still lingered with the pride and unity they had forged together. She took a sip of coffee, the warmth spreading down her throat, and reflected on a moment from a night before when her M24 hit the gas tank, when Tom, Ellie, Hank, and the whole town stood up, when the scarred man transformed from a confident predator into a panicked loser. They had won, not just with bullets, but through the power of unity. But Emily knew this victory wasn't the end. The scarred man had shouted before he left, "This isn't over." And even though she didn't want to admit it, she felt he was right. He would come back, or someone else would show up with more people, more weapons. But this time, she wasn't afraid, not with Willow Creek standing behind her. The familiar sound of a truck rumbling down the dirt road caught Emily's attention, and she looked up to see Tom's rusty red pickup rolling in. He stepped out, his prosthetic leg creaking slightly, and flashed her a crooked smile. "It's pretty quiet this morning, isn't it?" he said, his voice deep but laced with a hint of humor. Emily chuckled softly and nodded. "Quieter than I expected." "Thank you, Tom. If it weren't for you, Ellie, Hank, and everyone else last night, I don't know what would have happened." Tom shrugged and sat down on the porch step next to her. "Don't thank me. You're the one who started this whole thing, Emily. I'm just doing my part. But I have to say, you handled that sniper rifle like a pro. Is there something going on behind the scenes?" Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with a hint of hesitation, but then she decided it was time for them to know the truth, at least part of it. "I used to be a Green Beret," she said, her voice small but firm. 20 years in the military, mostly as a marksman. I left to raise Grace and Liam, so they wouldn't have to live in that world. But last night, I had no other choice." Tom was silent for a moment, his gaze a mix of admiration and surprise. "Green Beret, huh? I suspected you weren't ordinary when I saw the way you moved. But you know what, Emily? Last night wasn't just about that gun. It was because you made us stand up with you." She nodded, feeling a warm wave wash over her. Tom was right. The M24 could scare the scar guy off, but it was the unity of Willow Creek that made him run. She stood up, gazing out at the fields, and heard another vehicle approaching. This time it was Mr. Jim's patrol car. The sheriff stepped out, holding a small notebook, his eyes showing a hint of fatigue, but still sharp. "How's it going this morning, Emily?" he asked, walking closer. "Better than last night," she replied, offering a faint smile. "Thanks for getting here so quickly, Jim. You really scared them off." Mr. Jim scoffed, shaking his head. "Not me. It's the whole crowd behind you. I'm just here to clean up. But I've got news for you. Those guys aren't locals. I found some traces from the burned vehicle. They're a motorcycle gang from the south, known for intimidating small farms, forcing them to sell their land or pay protection money." Emily furrowed her brow, gripping her coffee cup tightly. "So they're coming back?" Mr. Jim shrugged, his voice dropping. "Maybe, but after last night, I'm not sure they want to face this whole town again. You taught them a lesson. Emily not with a gun, but by turning Willow Creek into something they can't break." Tom nodded, stood up, and patted Mr. Jim on the shoulder. "You're right. They thought they could bully one person, but now they know they're up against all of us." She turned back to the house, set her coffee cup down on the porch, and stepped inside. Grace was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, her eyes lighting up when she saw her mom. "Mom, everyone was amazing last night," Grace said, her voice filled with pride. "I heard Mrs. Ellie shooting, Tom yelling, and even Mr. Hank. They were like superheroes." Emily laughed, sitting down next to her. "They are superheroes, sweetie. Not because they're strong or have guns, but because they stand up together. That's true strength, not bullying others, but protecting what you love. Grace nodded, her eyes reflecting a hint of contemplation, as if she was beginning to grasp something much bigger. Liam stumbled from the sofa into the kitchen, his hair a wild mess, with Max trotting closely behind. "Mom, I dreamed we defeated the bad guys," the little boy exclaimed, jumping onto the chair next to Grace. Emily laughed heartily, ruffling his hair. "You're not dreaming, Liam. We really did it last night. But it wasn't just me. Everyone out there helped too." Liam beamed, wrapping his arms around Max. "So Max is a superhero too, right, Mom?" Emily nodded, glancing at the loyal dog. "Yes, Max is part of the team as well." She stood up and looked out the window, where Tom and Mr. Jim were still chatting in the yard. She thought about the scarred guy, his confidence, the way he believed that strength was about bullying and destruction. But last night, Willow Creek had taught him a different lesson. True strength doesn't lie in weapons or numbers, but in those who are willing to stand up for one another. She had once been a lone warrior in the Green Beret, surviving on skill and cold determination, but now she realized that her greatest strength wasn't her M24. It was Grace, Liam, and this whole town. They had triumphed not just because she could shoot, but because they trusted each other, because they refused to let fear conquer them. Emily stepped out onto the porch once more, gazing at the fields of wheat swaying in the breeze. She knew the Scar Man could come back, but this time she wasn't worried. Willow Creek had transformed. It was no longer just a small town, but a community ready to face any storm. She smiled, feeling a sense of peace wash over her heart. The lesson from last night wasn't just a scarred man. It was for her as well. That true strength isn't about fighting alone, but about finding those who will stand with you when the darkness closes in. The midday sun flooded Willow Creek, illuminating Emily Carter's farm as a reminder that the darkness of the night before had passed. Emily stood in the front yard, holding a broom to sweep up the debris from a burned motorcycle left by the scarred man, her deep blue eyes showing a hint of fatigue, yet still shining with determination. Grace and Liam ran around the yard, playing with Max, their laughter echoing through the tranquil space, as if the confrontation from the night before was just a distant dream. But the scorched marks on the ground and a few broken metal pieces were proof that it had all been real, and Emily knew that their victory was not just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of something bigger, a lesson that she and the entire town would carry with them forever. She stopped sweeping and looked up as she heard Hank's truck rolling in. The old man stepped down, his wispy white hair blowing the wind, his bony hands holding a box of donuts that he knew Liam loved. "How's it going this morning, Emily?" he asked, his voice raspy yet warm, his keen eyes scanning the yard as if checking to see if everything was all right. Emily smiled, setting the broom aside and stepping closer. "Better than I thought. Hank, thank you for calling Jim last night. Without you, things could have been a lot worse." Hank scoffed, handing her the box of donuts. "Don't thank me. You're the one who got them moving. Emily, I just did a small part. But I have to say, the way the whole town rallied around you, I've never seen anything like it." Emily nodded, holding the box of donuts and watching Grace and Liam run over, cheering when they spotted Mr. Hank's gift. "Donuts! Mr. Hank is the best." Liam shouted, jumping up to hug the old man, while Grace chuckled softly, grabbed one, and took a bite. Emily sat down on the porch steps, watching the kids, feeling a warm wave wash over her. Hank sat beside her, a thoughtful look in his eyes. "You know," he said, his voice dropping, "I've lived in Willow Creek my whole life, and I always thought we were just a bunch of ordinary folks getting by. But last night, you made me see that we're stronger than I thought. Not because of guns or anything like that, but because we don't abandon each other." Hank's words touched Emily's heart, and she turned to look at him, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I didn't know that either, Hank. I used to think strength was about fighting alone. That's how I lived as a Green Beret. But last night, I learned that true strength is having people ready to stand by you, even if they're not soldiers, not warriors." Hank nodded, patting her shoulder. "You're right. They think we're weak, but we've shown them just how wrong they are." The sound of another vehicle approached, and this time it was Mrs. Ellie, stepping down from the pickup truck, with shotgun still strapped to her hip. The petite but tough old woman walked over, her eyes lighting up when she saw Emily and Hank. "Hey, you too," she said, her voice raspy yet full of energy. "I just talked to some of my old friends. They heard about last night and want to throw a party at Hank's to celebrate. What do you think, Emily?" Emily burst into laughter, feeling completely relieved for the first time that day. "That sounds amazing, Ellie. But not just to celebrate, I want to thank everyone. If it weren't for you, Tom, and all of you, I don't know what I would have done." Mrs. Ellie smirked and sat down next to Hank. "Don't say that, girl. You're the one with the sniper rifle, making them scared out of their wits. I'm just adding a little spice. But I have to admit, the way you rallied these folks, it's like you knew we'd stand up." Emily shook her head, gazing out at the field. "I'm not sure, Ellie. I just hope, and you all have proven me right." Mrs. Ellie laughed heartily, slapping her thigh. "Hope is a good thing. Hold on to it, and we'll get through anything." Tom appeared shortly after, his rusty red pickup parked next to Mrs. Ellie's car. He stepped out, his prosthetic leg creaking, and carried a toolbox as if he was planning to fix something. "I heard there's a party," he said, his eyes lifting with a smile. "But first, I thought I should check on you, Emily. Last night was pretty intense." Emily stood up and walked over to him. "I'm fine, Tom. Thanks to you. I didn't have to shoot anyone. I couldn't have done better than that shot at the gas can." Tom shrugged, a hint of pride in his eyes. "I used to be a soldier. I know how to handle those bastards. But you, Emily, you're the one leading these folks. Green Beret or not, you're the heart of this whole thing." Emily looked at Tom, then Hank, then Ellie, and felt a wave of emotion rise within her. She used to think strength was a skill, a gun in hand, the ability to take down enemies from a distance. But now, she realized that true strength was what she saw in front of her ordinary people with callous hands, each with their own stories, ready to stand up for one another. The scarred man and his gang of bikers thought strength was about intimidation, about destruction, but Willow Creek had taught them and her that true strength is love, trust, and knowing you're never alone. She turned back to look at Grace and Liam, who were sharing the last donut, while Max lay beside them, wagging his tail excitedly. "Mom, can we go to the party?" Liam asked, his mouth covered in sugar. Emily smiled and nodded. "Of course, sweetie. We're all going. This isn't just a party. It's to thank everyone for keeping us safe." Grace looked at her, her eyes lighting up. "You were right this morning, Mom. True strength is about protecting each other, not bullying anyone." Emily hugged Grace, feeling her heart warmer than ever. "You're so smart, Grace. I'm so proud of you." As the sun climbed higher, Emily led the kids inside to get ready for the party. Hank, Ellie, and Tom stayed out in the yard, chatting and laughing, their voices ringing out like a melody of togetherness. Emily stood at the door, watching them and thinking about the scarred man. He could come back, but right now, she wasn't worried. He thought strength was in numbers, in weapons, in fear, but he was wrong. True strength was what she saw in Willow Creek. The ordinary neighbors, the simple stories, and the unyielding spirit. She had once been a lone warrior, but now she was part of something bigger community that had taught her that victory isn't just about defeating the enemy, but about building something that can't be broken. She stepped out into the yard once more, joining Hank, Ellie, and Tom, and for the first time in many years, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. The scarred guy might not grasp this lesson, but Emily did, and she would carry it with her along with Willow Creek, ready to face any storm ahead. True strength isn't about fighting alone. It's about standing up together, and that's something she would never forget. The afternoon in Willow Creek drifted by with a rare tranquility, the soft golden sunlight streaming through the wheat stalks, casting a simple beauty over Emily Carter's farm that she had learned to cherish. After the small gathering at Hank's place, where the townsfolk came together to celebrate their victory over the scarred man and his gang of bikers, everything seemed to return to normal. Grace and Liam were playing with Max in the yard, their laughter mingling with the sound of the wind rustling through the pine trees, while Emily sat on the porch, holding a cold glass of water, her deep blue eyes gazing out over the fields. Last night, she had felt the true strength of community not from the M24 in her hands, but from Hank, Ellie, Tom, and the ordinary folks ready to stand up for one another. But just when she thought the story had come to a close, something unexpected happened. opening a new chapter she hadn't anticipated. The phone rang from inside the house, shattering the silence. Emily stood up, walked into the kitchen, and picked up an old landline phone that she rarely used. "Hello, this is Emily Carter," she said, her voice soft but tinged with a hint of caution. On the other end was a strange male voice, deep and slightly hurried. "Ms. Carter, this is Mike Dawson, a reporter from the Wyoming Tribune. I heard about what happened last night in Willow Creek, how a gang of bikers was chased out of town. Is that true? I'd like to write a piece about it." Emily frowned, gripping the receiver tightly. "How do you know?" she asked, her voice dropping. Mike chuckled softly on the line. "Word travels fast, Miss Carter. Someone at Hank's called me this morning. I'd like to meet with you to hear the whole story. This could be big news." Emily was silent for a moment, gazing out the yard where Grace and Liam were tossing a ball to Max. She didn't want the spotlight or attention. She just wanted to protect her family and the town. But then she thought about the scarred man, about his threat to come back, and about the other farms that might be facing the same danger. If this story got out, maybe it would inspire others to stand up like Willow Creek had. "All right," she finally said, "you come over here. But I'm not telling this alone. I want everyone to speak up." Mike immediately agreed, his voice tinged with excitement. "I'll be there in an hour." "Thank you, Miss Carter." When she hung up, Grace walked in, her hair tousled by the wind, her eyes full of curiosity. "Who called, Mom?" she asked. Emily sat down at the kitchen table, pulling Grace close. "A reporter, sweetie. He wants to write about what happened last night, how we and everyone else stood up to the bad guys." Liam ran in, Max bouncing behind him, and shouted, "Are we going to be famous, Mom? Like superheroes on TV?" Emily laughed, ruffling the boy's hair. "Not exactly, Liam, but maybe this will help others who are being bullied like we were." Grace nodded, her eyes lighting up. "So that's good, right? If others know, they can be strong like us too." Emily hugged both of them, feeling a new spark of hope flicker inside her. She never imagined that their small victory could reach anyone beyond Willow Creek. An hour later, Mike Dawson arrived, a middle-aged man with messy brown hair and a camera slung around his neck. He parked next to the farm, got out, and shook Emily's hand with a friendly smile. "Ms. Carter, thank you for agreeing to meet. I heard you were the one leading the charge last night against a motorcycle gang as a single mother. That's truly an incredible story." Emily shrugged, leading him into the house. "It wasn't just me, Mike. It was the whole town. I'll call everyone over. They're all part of the story." She dialed Hank, Ellie, and Tom, and before long, they showed up, still carrying the pride from the night before. Hank sat down on the sofa, recounting how he called out to Jim and grabbed a shovel to stand up with everyone. "I'm not going to let them burn anyone's house down around here," he said, his voice rough but firm. Ellie laughed heartily, sharing the story of a bullet that skimmed the ground, startling the scar guy. "They think I'm just a useless old lady, but I've shot wolves from over 100 meters away," she said, her eyes lighting up. Tom talked about hitting a gas can with a shot, a hint of humor in his gaze. "I'm not going to let her fight alone. This is my home, too," he said, his prosthetic leg creaking as he shifted his position. Mike jotted down notes quickly, his camera flashing continuously, while Emily sat quietly, listening, feeling that their story was bigger than she had imagined. When it was her turn, Emily briefly shared that she used to be a Green Beret, how she held the M24 to protect Grace and Liam, but she emphasized the most important thing. "I didn't win because of the gun," she said, her voice low but clear. "I won because of these people, Hank, Ellie, Tom, and the whole town. True strength isn't about bullying or destruction. It's about standing together, protecting what you love." Mike stopped writing, looking at her with admiration. "You're amazing, Emily. This story isn't just about Willow Creek. It has the power to inspire thousands out there." The interview wrapped up as the sun began to set, and Mike left with a promise to send her the article for review before publishing. Emily stood on the porch, watching Grace and Liam play with Max in the golden glow of the sunset, feeling a wave of emotion wash over her. She never expected that one night of fighting to protect the farm could resonate so far. But as she thought about other towns, other farmers, families that might be facing threats like hers. She realized that this story wasn't just about the victory of Willow Creek. It was a small flame, capable of igniting hope in other places, showing them that they didn't have to succumb to fear. She turned back to look at Hank, Ellie, and Tom, chatting in the yard, laughing like old friends. They had no idea that their story was about to reach beyond Wyoming. But Emily felt the impact of last night wouldn't stop here. It would spread, not through gunfire or violence, but through hope, through the lesson that true strength lies in unity. She smiled, embracing Grace and Liam as they ran over, feeling her heart lighter than ever. Willow Creek had changed her, and now, maybe it would change the world out there too. The morning in Willow Creek shone brightly under the early sunlight, with dewdrops sparkling on the wheat fields like a gentle greeting after days of tension. Emily Carter stood in the kitchen, stirring a pan of scrambled eggs, the delicious aroma blending with the sounds of Grace and Liam playfully arguing over who got to play with Max first. The loyal sheepdog lay stretched out on the floor, its ears twitching every time Liam shouted, "I'm the superhero! Max has to follow me!" Emily smiled as she set the plate of eggs on the table, feeling a peace she never thought could return after a confrontation with the scarred man. But just as she sat down with the kids, the landline phone rang, pulling her away from that warm moment. She stepped up to the phone, her voice gentle yet tinged with a hint of caution. "Hello, this is Emily Carter." On the other end was Mike Dawson, his voice deep and filled with excitement. "Ms. Carter, the article was published this morning. The Wyoming Tribune has it on the front page. Willow Creek. Small town takes down motorcycle gang. I'm sending you a copy through the mail, but I have to say, the response is explosive. People have been calling the newsroom all morning." Emily frowned, gripping the receiver tightly. "What kind of response, Mike?" He laughed heartily over the phone. "They're calling you a hero, Emily, but not just you, the whole town. People want to know how a bunch of farmers and neighbors managed to chase off a motorcycle gang. This isn't just local news anymore. The big papers in Denver and Salt Lake City want to cover it too." Emily stayed silent, watching Grace and Liam share a plate of eggs, her eyes flickering with a hint of confusion. She didn't want to be a hero. She just wanted to protect her family in Willow Creek. But as Mike continued, his tone grew more serious. "I've had a few people from other towns call in, saying they're being harassed by gangs like this too. They asked me how to get in touch with you, Emily. They want to learn from Willow Creek." She took a deep breath, feeling a wave of warmth mixed with pressure rise within her. "I'm not sure I have anything to teach them, Mike. We're just doing what needs to be done." Mike chuckled softly. "That's exactly what makes this story special. I'll come by this afternoon with a few calls. You can decide if you want to talk to them or not." When she hung up, Grace looked up, her sharp gaze filled with a hint of curiosity. "Who is it this time, Mom?" Emily sat down, taking a piece of Liam's egg from his plate. The boy grumbled but still smiled and replied, "It's that reporter from yesterday, sweetie. The article about us is out now, and people far away are asking about it." Liam exclaimed, jumping up on his chair. "Are we famous now, Mom? Like superheroes for real?" Emily laughed, ruffling his hair. "Not exactly, Liam, but maybe we've helped someone feel a little stronger." Grace nodded, her voice small but firm. "If they see that we can do it, they'll believe they can too, right?" Emily hugged Grace, feeling her heart swell with warmth. "That's right, sweetheart. That's what I hoped for." At noon, Mike arrived as promised, bringing a stack of sticky notes and a bright smile. He sat down at the kitchen table with Emily, while Grace and Liam lingered nearby, curious to listen in. "Here's the list," Mike said, sliding the stack of paper toward her. 10 towns from Montana to Idaho have called asking about Willow Creek. They said they're being harassed by gangs like yours, pressured to sell their land, and having their homes burned down if they refuse. They want to know how you guys won. Emily looked at the list, the unfamiliar names like Pine Hollow, Red Butte, and Cedar Flats dancing before her eyes. She felt a wave of emotion rise up, not pride, but a sense of responsibility. "I'm not the leader, Mike," she said, her voice low. "It's Hank, Ellie, Tom, the whole town. I just fired the first shot." Mike nodded, his eyes lighting up. "I know, and I wrote that. But you're the one who sparked it, Emily. You showed them that a small town can stand up. Now they want to learn not to shoot guns, but to unite like you all did." Emily looked out the window, where Hank was driving by, waving at her. She thought about that night the gunfire from Ellie, Tom's shot, Hank's shovel, and realized that this story wasn't just hers. It belonged to Willow Creek, and if it could help other places, she couldn't turn her back. She turned back to look at Mike, her voice more assured. "All right, I'll talk to them. But I want Hank, Ellie, and Tom to be involved too. This isn't just my story." Mike let out a hearty laugh, jotting something down on paper. "Fantastic. I'll make it happen. But I warn you, Emily, this could be bigger than you think. I've heard some news stations want to cover it too." Emily shrugged, a faint smile on her lips. "Let them come. If it helps someone, I don't mind." As Mike walked away, Emily stood on the porch, watching Grace and Liam play with Max in the sunlight. She never imagined that one night of protecting the farm could resonate so far, but as she thought of other towns, of farmers and families living in fear, she felt a small flame ignite in her heart. Willow Creek had done it, and now their story could spark hope for thousands out there. The late afternoon in Willow Creek brought a refreshing breeze, sweeping to the fields of barley on Emily Carter's farm, making the stalks sway like waves. Emily sat on the porch, holding a cold glass of water, her deep blue eyes watching Grace and Liam play with Max under the sunset. Their laughter echoed in the peaceful air, but her mind was spinning with what Mike Dawson had said that morning. The article about Willow Creek's victory wasn't just staying in Wyoming. It was spreading, reaching distant towns in need of hope. She had agreed to talk with them, along with Hank, Ellie, and Tom, but as the sunlight faded, she began to feel the weight of the responsibility that she hadn't anticipated. The sound of Hank's truck rumbled down the dirt road, pulling her out of her thoughts. The old man stepped down, holding a stack of newspapers that he waved around like a trophy. "Emily, have you seen this?" he called out, his voice raspy yet full of excitement. She stood up, walked over, and took the Wyoming Tribune from his hands. The front page hit her like a ton of bricks with a bold headline, "Willow Creek. Small town takes down the motorcycle gang," accompanied by a photo of her standing between Tom and Ellie, M24 in hand, her gaze steady. Hank let out a hearty laugh, patting her on the shoulder. "I bought a whole dozen at Joe's store. The whole town is talking about this. We're famous now." Emily gave a faint smile, but inside, joy mingled with a hint of anxiety. "I'm not sure I want to be famous, Hank, but if it helps someone, then it's worth it." Hank sat down on the porch steps, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "I just heard from Jim that some folks from Pine Hollow called him, asking about us. They said they've been dealing with a motorcycle gang bothering them all year, even burning a few barns to scare them. They want to come here to meet you, Emily." She frowned and set the newspaper down. "Why do they want to meet me? I'm not an expert. We're just doing what needs to be done." Hank chuckled softly, patting his knee. "That's exactly what they need, not some grand plan, but to see that regular folks like us can stand up. You're the spark, Emily, whether you want to be or not." Before she could respond, the sound of another vehicle echoed. This time it was Tom and Ellie's truck. Tom stepped out, his prosthetic leg creaking, a tool bag in hand as usual, while Ellie carried an old hunting rifle. The old woman's eyes lit up when she saw Emily and Hank. "I heard we're about to have some visitors from Pine Hollow," Ellie said, her voice raspy but full of energy. "Mike called me this afternoon. He said we should get ready because it's not just Pine Hollow, but Red Butte and Cedar Flats want to come too." Tom nodded and sat down next to Hank. "I've heard from a few old buddies in Idaho as well. They say this news is spreading fast. Emily, the big news stations are calling Mike, wanted to interview us on TV." Emily felt her heart racing, not out of fear, but from a mix of excitement and overwhelm. She sat down among them, gazing out at the fields, trying to gather her thoughts. "I didn't expect this to get so big," she said, her voice low. "I just want to protect Grace and Liam, to keep this farm safe. Now the whole world knows about us." Ellie burst out laughing, giving her a reassuring pat on the back. "You think we did this just for you? This is our home too, Emily, and if we can help those folks out there, then let them know. We got nothing to hide." Tom nodded, a hint of pride in his eyes. "You've shown us that we're stronger than we think. Now it's our turn to show others. She stood up, stepped out into the yard, and watched Grace and Liam running around, with Max happily barking behind them. She thought about the scar guy, his confidence, the way he believed that strength meant intimidation and destruction, and then she considered the other towns that might be facing people like him. If Willow Creek could inspire, if their story could help other farmers, other families stand up, then she couldn't turn her back. She turned back to Hank, Ellie, and Tom, her voice more certain than ever. All right, if they want to come, we'll meet them. But not just to tell our story, we'll show them how we do things. Not with guns, but by trusting each other. Hank laughed heartily, stood up, and clapped his hands. Now that's the Emily I know. I'll call Jim and have him arrange accommodations at the tavern for the folks from Pine Hollow. Ellie, you handle those old friends of ours. We need some extra hands. Ellie smirked, raising her shotgun. I've got this. If they need to learn how to shoot, I'll teach them how to hit a target from 100 yards. Tom chuckled, his eyes lighting up. I'll reach out to some old buddies from the army not to fight, but to show everyone how to keep their spirits high. What do you think, Emily? She nodded, smiling. Sounds great. But I want Grace and Liam to join in too. They're part of this whole thing. As darkness began to settle in, Emily led Grace and Liam into the house, preparing for the busy days ahead. She could hear Hank, Ellie, and Tom chatting outside, their voices echoing like a melody of unity. But then, the phone rang again, and this time it was Mike. Emily, I just got word that a national news station wants to interview you in the whole town. They said this isn't just about America anymore. Groups in Canada and Mexico are hearing about it and want to follow suit. What do you think? Emily fell silent, glancing at Grace and Liam sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes lighting up with new thought. If they want to know, let them come, she said, her voice steady. But we'll tell the real story not about heroes, but about ordinary people standing together. Mike laughed heartily over the phone. I knew you'd say that. I'll make it happen. Get ready. Emily Willow Creek is about to become a symbol. When she hung up, Grace looked at her, her eyes filled with pride. Mom, we're really helping so many people, aren't we? Emily hugged Grace, pulling Liam into her embrace, and nodded. Yes, sweetheart, and we're going to keep doing it. She stepped out onto the porch, gazing up at the starry sky, feeling a fire ignite within her. The scar guy thought strength was about destruction, but Willow Creek had proven the opposite. True strength is about spreading hope, and now it's reaching far beyond Wyoming, touching the world out there. The morning in Willow Creek was radiant with golden sunlight, but the atmosphere around Emily Carter's farm carried an unexpected tension. Just a few days after their story spread across Wyoming and beyond through Mike Dawson's article, a sleek black SUV pulled up in front of her house. The dirt caked on its tires, as if it had just come from a long journey. Emily stood on the porch, holding a cup of coffee, her deep blue eyes squinting as a man stepped out in a black suit, his hair slicked back, and a smooth smile that resembled a salesman. Grace and Liam were playing with Max near the chicken coop, their laughter ringing out in the peaceful air. But Emily sensed that this tranquility was about to be tested once again. The man approached, extending his hand in an overly friendly manner. Ms. Carter, I'm Richard Hayes from Hayes Security Solutions, he said smoothly. I've heard about your amazing work with Willow Creek, a small town that took down a motorcycle gang. My company is very impressed. Emily furrowed her brow, setting her coffee cup down on the railing, her tone calm yet cautious. Thank you, but I don't think we need compliments from a security company. What do you want? Richard laughed heartily, pulling out a stack of documents from his briefcase. Not just compliments, Ms. Carter. I have a proposal. Hayes Security wants to partner with you and this town. We'll fund everything: money, equipment, training. We'll turn Willow Creek into a model for other communities under our brand. Emily fell silent. Looking at the stack of documents, he presented big numbers, promises of money and protection. She heard Grace calling for Liam in the distance, and her gaze wavered for a moment. This was what she had once dreamed of. Enough money to pay off the bank, keep the farm, and provide Grace and Liam with a stable future. But then she thought of Hank, Ellie, and Tom, people who stood up not for money or a brand, but out of love for this land. She pushed the stack of documents back to Richard, her voice steady. Thank you, but we don't need your brand. What we do is ours, not for sale." Richard frowned, the smile on his face stiffening. "You don't understand, Miss Carter. This is a huge opportunity money. Fame, safety. You turn it down, and guys like that one from that night will come back stronger. Do you really want to risk Grace and Liam?" His words struck at the deep-seated fear within Emily, and she felt her heart tighten. She had been a Green Beret, had survived the most dangerous missions, but now she was a mother, and the thought of Grace and Liam in danger made her hesitate. She turned back to look at the kids, running around with Max, and felt a wave of emotion rise up, not fear, but determination. She turned back to face Richard, her gaze as cold as when she held the M24 that night. "Do you think our strength is something that can be bought?" she asked, her voice low but sharp. "We don't win because of money or equipment. We win because Hank wields a pickaxe, because Ellie shoots a hunting rifle, because Tom doesn't give up even with just one leg. We win because we are family, not your brand." Richard took a step back, his expression showing a hint of confusion. "You're missing out on a huge opportunity," he said, his voice dropping. "The world is watching Willow Creek. Don't let it just be a small story that fades into oblivion." Emily offered a faint smile as she stepped down to the ground and looked him straight in the eye. "The world doesn't need your brand to remember us. They'll remember because we show them that true strength isn't something you can buy. It's something you build together." She pointed toward the field where Hank, Ellie, and Tom had stood that night. "We don't need you. If that scarred guy or anyone else comes back, we'll face them just like we did, not for money, but because this is home." Richard gritted his teeth, his expression darkening, but he didn't say anything more. He turned back to his car, tossed the folder into the back seat, and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Emily stood still, watching the SUV disappear from view, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. Grace ran up to her, wrapping her arms around her, her eyes sparkling. "Who was that, Mom?" Emily bent down, ruffling Grace's hair. "Someone who wanted to buy our story, sweetie. But I'm not selling." Liam jumped up, with Max barking along, and shouted, "We're superheroes. No one can buy superheroes." Emily laughed heartily, hugging both of them, feeling her heart warmer than ever. She turned back to the porch, gazing at the fields of wheat swaying in the breeze. Hayes Security might come back, or others would arrive with bigger offers, but she wasn't worried. Willow Creek had triumphed not just over the scarred man, but over the temptations of money and fame. Their true victory didn't lie on the battlefield, but in their unwavering commitment to what made them who they were: love, unity, and an indomitable spirit. She lifted her coffee cup, took a sip, and smiled. The world might look at Willow Creek, but they would see a story that couldn't be bought, a story of true strength, transcending everything money could touch. Thank you for joining us on the journey of Emily Carter and Willow Creek, where a single mother in a small town have shown that true strength lies not in guns, but in love and unity. From Emily's gunshots to Hank's shovel, they transformed fear into hope, spreading inspiration far beyond Wyoming. If your heart resonates with this story, please hit like and subscribe so you won't miss the next inspiring tales. We are proud to have you, those who believe that anyone can stand up and protect what they cherish. See you in the next video. Stay tough, stay proud, and see you soon